Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D and WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku were sent to Sonic the Hedgehog's world. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Believe it or not, Isuku Midoriya was once happy. Before the day everything went down, he had a supporting mother, a father-like mentor, and a whole bundle of friends that he could even call his family. Sure, he still had the responsibility of being the ninth holder of OFA, but he was still happy. A lot had changed in the last 2 years. Dirt and grime covered the masked hero's face as he looked down at the city below him. It seemed as though there was some sort of riot or crime going on every minute, and Isuku was tired. But more importantly, he was full of vitriol. He hated everything. He hated this stupid city that did nothing but beat him down. He hated the chilling grin of the man that took everything away from him. And he hated himself for allowing things to spiral out of control like this. The 17-year-old closed his eyes with a defeated sigh, imagining of times better. He could see his classmates through his closed eyelids, beckoning him to lie down and finally join them. A droplet of rain landing on his nose awakened him from his trance. No matter how tempting it was, he couldn't leave now. He knew that he'd never be able to leave. He thought back to the moment he accepted the legendary quirk and sighed. Was it really worth it? Isuku heard a loud noise in the distance and his head snapped towards the sound, seeing a large billowing explosion wreaking havoc on a building. He looked down at the giant tower he was standing on and pulled his withered mask over his head once more, before leaping off of it, creating a small shockwave as he launched himself towards the building. He flew through the air at incredible speeds and halted himself above the building using float. He looked around, seeing no offenders. Hell, the entire street was completely silent save for the crackling embers of a now dying fire. He looked up, seeing that the light drizzle had turned into a pouring rain. Isuku hummed in annoyance as he landed in front of the building, trying the door. It was locked, of course. Using 2% of OFA and his own strength, he easily shoved the door off of its hinges, nearly launching it. 8 thick strands of black whip shot out of his back. Grabbing into the door and holding it in place, he dropped it with a harsh thud. And it was safe to say that he wasn't expecting the sight in front of him. The interior itself looked like it had been abandoned for quite a while, but the large tunnel leading underground inside the house was freshly lit with hanging light bulbs. Isuku took a surprised breath before entering the building and looking around the normal part of the building. It had seemed to be a bank of some sort. There wasn't anything useful around the main area, and the only way to go was through the tunnel. Isuku sighed, beginning his trek down the dugout tunnel, looking around warily as he walked. There were scribbles of red along the walls, akin to that of a madman. Our savior has arrived. One read, "All hail the Eon Empire." Another said, the scribbles having partially faded away. Isuku shook his head, hoping he didn't have to deal with another cult. After minutes of walking, he finally arrived to a highly advanced metal door. The contrast of concrete walls and dingy lights along with the shiny metal door that beeped every so often was not lost on Isuku, who walked towards the door. A holographic sensor appeared, attempting to scan Isuku. After a second, a calming female voice rang from the door. "Face not recognized," it said. Isuku rolled his eyes under his mask and electricity cracked as he shoved his fist through the metallic door, easily making a hole large enough for him to step through. The sight that graced him was concerning, to say the least. A group of at least 20 figures covered by red robes were facing him. Isuku immediately tensed up, preparing for battle, when the figures all cheered at his arrival. "The vessel is here," one said. "It's finally time," another proclaimed. Isuku was so shaken that he nearly let his guard down. A large figure walked up to him, his red robe emblazoned with real gold. "It is a pleasure to meet you. We have been waiting here for you for months," the figure said, voice booming throughout the well-lit bunker. Isuku blinked under his mask. "What?" he started, only for another person to walk up to him, this time a thin woman. "You must be confused. Over a year ago, each of us received a transmission on each of our personal devices, coming from millions of miles away," she explained hurriedly. Isuku blinked once more, already nearly lost. "You see, we're all engineers that were working on a confidential project for the Japanese government when we received the transmission. We were given a strict set of instructions to follow, and if we did, then he would reward us handsomely by letting us live leisurely in paradise." The woman rambled, sounding utterly insane. And it seemed like Isuku wasn't too far off from that guess, as she gestured to a massive sketchy ring-shaped machine. It was thrumming with energy, and Izuku's hairs were standing on end from just being near it. On the left and right of the machine were 2 shoddily hand-painted red logos of a oval-shaped face with a bushy mustache and goggles. Isuku blinked at the machine. After a second he sighed, before he became a blur. In a second, every robed person in the room fell to the ground, unconscious. A group had obviously lost their minds, worshipping some prank or something. Really, millions of miles away. What? Did it come from a different dimension or something? That was ridiculous. Isuku took his communicator out of his pocket, pressing the large red button on the side that patched him directly to Commissioner Tsukachi. Almost immediately, a voice crackled through the machine. "Deku, what is it this time?" he asked. Izuku looked around with a sigh. Irritated? "I just stumbled upon a cult." "Yes, before you ask, it's a full-blown cult just like last time." No, they weren't worshipping the radio demon this time, whatever the hell that is. Izuku finished, before the communicator suddenly powered off. Izuku blinked, before he growled. "You have got to be kidding. It decides to die now." He asked to nobody in particular. He shook his head, before the lights around him flickered, and he immediately dropped the communicator, getting into a battle-ready pose. However, he didn't hear the crack of plastic upon metal. He turned to see the communicator floating midair, slowly twirling around in place. Izuku's eyes widened and he stepped back, only for the now familiar thrumming sound coming from the machine to grow louder. He turned to look at the machine as some sort of energy swirled around in the ring. Izuku blinked in awe as the thrumming sound grew louder and a small white portal appeared in the middle of the ring, slowly growing larger. Everything was still for a second, until a panel of metal from the machine bent, getting sucked towards the portal. He then felt his body getting dragged forwards and started panicking. He activated One for All, but it simply fizzled out as the energy from the portal encompassed him. He tried using Black Whip, but the same thing happened. He looked around, seeing that he was the only person being dragged towards the portal, and desperately tried to dig his iron soles into the ground, to no avail. He was barely a foot away from the portal now, and he had to cover his eyes as the bright light was nearly blinding to him. As he flew closer to the portal, he grit his teeth, trying anything and everything to halt his progress, but it was for nothing. As the bright light finally encompassed him, and the feeling of his body being ripped apart and put back together caused him to pass out, Izuku awoke on an uncomfortable flat bed. He looked around blearily, before noticing that his costume had been removed, and he was in a tight-fitting red jumpsuit with that same mustached face from before imprinted over his chest, and comfortable black slippers over his feet. He sat up, looking down at his palm as a spark of electricity swashed through him. He sighed, relieved. He still had access to One for All. He stood up, legs wobbling for a second. It looked like traveling through portals seemed to affect your equilibrium for a bit. After a minute, he was comfortably standing, and he looked at the familiar metallic door with blinking red lights. He hoped he didn't have to tear this one apart as well. He walked towards it, eyes widening in surprise as it opened immediately with a soft swishing sound. He peeked out to see a vast hallway, connected to dozens of other mechanical doors. However, the sound of a blowtorch echoed throughout. Wherever he was, he narrowed his eyes, following the sound. He was on guard for anything that could possibly jump out at him, and he was relieved as he made it to a large room with an equally large man using a blowtorch on something. Izuku narrowed his eyes, sparks of energy crackling around his fingers. The man's mustache twitched and he placed the blowtorch down, before turning to face him with a large welcoming grin. "Ah, you're finally awake. You had passed out during the teleportation process, so I had decided to give you a spare jumpsuit. I made sure it suited your exact measurements," the man stated in English. He was absolutely massive, towering over Izuku at a staggering 71. He wore a red top with a yellow cape attached to his shoulders, flowing down his back. The top was tucked into a pair of black pants that connected to black boots. Izuku looked at him cautiously as his mustache twitched once more, his rotund body cutting quite the intimidating figure. "Where am I? Who are you? Why am I here?" he asked, also speaking perfect English. The man's grin widened, before he held his gloves hands out, similar to that of an entertainer, and bowed. "My name is Dr. Ivo Robotnik, and you are in my lair. As for why you're here, we'll get to that later. More on you. You are quite the fine specimen. Did you know that your muscle mass is 9 times as dense as a normal human's?" The man rambled, Izuku barely being able to follow along. Izuku looked around, the massive room really accentuating the outgoing demeanor of the man. Izuku blinked, seeing a hint of dark green behind Robotnik, and his eyes widened. He walked around the man, seeing his costume. The dark green fabric seemed to have been changed. It looked softer, and the long white bracers were thinner, with matching metallic claws at the end of each glove. His leg bracers were also thinner, and had a metallic sheen to them. Finally, his black iron shoes looked mostly unchanged, though they were a bit bulkier. "You altered my costume, without my permission?" Izuku asked, narrowing his eyes at the mysterious doctor, though he was entirely unintimidated. "Yes, I did. I made several improvements. The tech in your costume was somewhat lacking, so I fixed it. Change into it and follow me. It's high time I explain just why you're here," Robotnik said, holding his hands behind his back and walking down the hallway that Izuku had come from. Izuku frowned at him as he walked, before sparks of OFA lit up around him and he changed at super speed, getting dressed in just under 15 seconds. Izuku then followed the doctor, who looked back at him with a hint of surprise. Already finished? Well, you're quite fast, he said, grin widening. Izuku was slightly unnerved as he fiddled with his new hood. The costume was slightly tighter around him, which he didn't really mind much. He had made it purposely baggy when he was younger as he felt embarrassed at the thought of someone taking a peek at his well-defined body, but he had grown out of that fear long ago. The mask, however, was almost entirely unchanged. It still had the 2 ears sticking out of the top, and it hid his face well. The only main difference was that it slid over his entire head instead of just covering the front. Honestly, it was a welcome change. He had always felt slightly uncomfortable wearing the mask as it rarely even stayed on right. Now though, it fit snug on his head. Robotnik led him to an even bigger room with white panels covering every surface. The room was almost as big as a football field. Izuku looked around, eyes wide. What the? He muttered, making Robotnik tweak his mustache a bit with a proud grin. Impressive, is it not? He said, causing Izuku to look at him, awe prevalent. He responded with a nod, and Robotnik reached into one of his pockets, pulling out a remote with a dial. He twisted the dial, and the room shook slightly before the panels started shifting, some rising, others forming structures. Izuku's eyes widened even further as the white panels then changed color, changing to a lavender color with ancient-looking engraving. A few of the panels even changed to look like bubbling lava. Welcome to an accurate recreation of Marble Zone. Now ... it's about time to test your abilities. If I deem that you're not what I expected, then I'll simply send you back to your world and look for another warrior. The doctor explained. Izuku narrowed his eyes before the man snapped his fingers. Izuku heard the sound of mechanical whirring, and turned around to see a few dozen robots now littering the area. Say hello to my badniks, robotic helpers that sometimes get the job done, Robotnik explained. Izuku studied the robots, noticing that they were designed to look like animals. There was a giant ladybug on a singular wheel, a flying bee with a cannon for a stinger, a chameleon that almost fully blended into the background, and even a large crab with small gun barrels inside its razor-sharp claws. Destroy all of my badniks in under a certain amount of time, and you pass my little test. You must understand that my opposition is not to be taken lightly, and has thwarted my plans of world peace multiple times. All I want is to harness the power of a certain set of jewels to create a new society, one where everyone is free to do as they please, and free from that repugnant rodent. The doctor ranted, clenching his fist with a scowl. Izuku began to get suspicious, as it sounded like a major villain monologue at the end there, but it was quickly pushed to the back of his mind as the doctor snapped his fingers again. One of the ladybugs rushed at him on its wheel, surprising him with its speed. I counted the robots earlier. There should only be 26 around here. This should be easy, Izuku thought, his body lighting up with sparks as he activated his legendary power. He hopped over the speeding bot, before grabbing the Motobug by the wheel and ripping it out. He then threw the robotic corpse in the ground and stomped on it, causing it to explode. Izuku looked back at the doctor to see a grin on his face. Good, the timer starts now. You have 3 minutes, he said. Izuku looked forward again to see 3 bees rushing at him. He jumped backwards, avoiding a few lasers that were shot out of the stingers, before rushing forwards, kicking one out of the air, and grabbing the other two's heads and slamming them together, crushing them in the process. 22 left. A crab jumped at him, claws grabbing at him. He jumped, using float to keep himself midair, and kicked both of the claws, crumpling them. He then shot a few strands of black whip that tied around some panels and pulled, sending him down onto the crab's head, crushing it. He was then shot in the back, making him wince. Even with 5%, he actually felt it. He turned around to see a chameleon blending into its surroundings. Luckily, he had sparred with Tsuyu enough to adapt to this kind of fighting style, and simply condensed the electricity flowing around his body into his 2 fists, and slammed his hands together, causing a wave of energy to explode outwards in a small area, acting as an EMP. Some of the panels sparked for a second, before rebooting. The chameleon, though, shut down, the camouflage disrupting. Danger sense then warned him of multiple approaching Motobugs, and he wrapped dozens of strands of black whip around each of them before swinging them around, destroying 7 other robots in the process. He dropped the Motobugs when they were unusable. 11 left. Robotnik watched from the sidelines as the boy destroyed his bots, mentally counting down, an unstable look in his eyes, covered by his thick glasses. Yes, he will do nicely, he muttered. Izuku dropped a hollow shell of a bee-bot, before turning to face the remaining 6 robots. With a grunt, he turned up the power a bit, going up to 12%, and dashed forward, leaving a trail of electricity in his wake. He then skidded to a stop, and all 6 bots simultaneously combusted. He exhaled, rolling his shoulder. A series of slow claps startled him, and he turned to face the doctor, who had an impressed smile on his face. Well done, very well done. You are all that I had hoped for. However, your test is not quite done. There is one more opponent I want you to face, the doctor said. Isuku then heard a series of metal clanks and turned to face a small robot. It looked far more durable than the others, and it glared up at him, eyes lit up with a menacing red sheen. Isuku raised an eyebrow at the robot, and it immediately copied his expression, his red eye changing to match that of his own. Isuku had to admit that he was a bit unnerved by the bot, but he didn't show it. Meet Metal Sonic, my finest and latest creation, he said. Isuku looked at the doctor, a questioning look on his face under his mask. Metal Sonic, what kind of name is that? He asked. The doctor briefly looked offended, before remembering that he hadn't explained who his enemy was yet. All will be explained in due time, my dear boy, the doctor said, and Isuku shivered as an unwelcome memory of a bloody smile passed through him. I'm so proud of you, my dear boy. The words echoed in his head like a curse, making him clench his fists for a moment before he took a small breath. He turned to the doctor. Continue, he stated. Robotnik hummed. Metal, meet ... HRM. I don't believe I caught your name, he said to Isuku, who grunted. Midoriya. My name is Midoriya, he told the doctor, whose grin returned. Metal, meet Midoriya. Now then, Metal, initiate combat mode, Robotnik said, making Isuku look at him in annoyance. I have to fight another one of your robots. We're at the last 20 HRNG. Isuku started, only to be cut off by a small fist embedding itself into his stomach. Isuku slid backwards a few feet, falling to one knee. He looked back up, barely avoiding a kick to the face, ducking under it. He performed a backwards handspring, activating OFA as he gained distance, immediately going to 10%. That punch hurt. He winced, knowing it was going to form a bruise. Metal Sonic dashed towards him, feet clanking against the ground at insane speeds. The robot pulled his fist back, and Isuku prepared a powerful right hook counter, ignoring the fear he felt as Metal Sonic robotically turned its head to face him. Suddenly, the robot disappeared from his view. Izuku looked around in confusion, stopping his punch. Danger Sense suddenly screamed at him, and he reacted on instinct, reaching behind him and trying to grab the machine's punch, only to receive a kick to the jaw. Izuku's head snapped up and he grit his teeth in pain. A double fake-out, he thought to himself, before narrowing his eyes in anger. Fine, you want to see my power. Just be prepared to repair this thing when I'm done, Izuku said, before the electricity around him nearly tripled in intensity. 25%, he stated internally, and the robot finally looked interested. Metal Sonic then dashed forward, attempting to get another swift punch in, only for Izuku to literally slap the attack away and grab the back of Metal Sonic's head, pulling him into a devastating knee that slammed into Metal's visor, cracking it. Metal stumbled backwards, his red eyes glitching out, before finally focusing as Izuku jumped in the air and delivered a 360 spin kick to the machine's cheek. Metal was sent flying, bouncing off the ground and slamming into the wall opposite of Izuku. It made a dent in the wall which it clawed its way out of, before glaring at Izuku, who almost flinched at the pure spite oozing from the digital red eyes. Izuku then summoned a thick strand of black whip, attacking at Metal's legs, who simply jumped into the air. Izuku smiled under his mask, before launching up after him, swiping at him. However, the turbine in his chest lit up, and a burst of flame poured from his back, and he evaded the attack, before kicking Izuku back down to the ground. Metal landed behind him, and Izuku groaned as he stood up. Metal was looking at him, waggling his index finger tauntingly at him. You're too slow, the robot said. Izuku grumbled to himself silently, getting to his feet. He inhaled deeply, before exhaling, a large amount of pink smoke exiting his rebreather, swiftly filling the room. Metal stopped taunting, keeping his guard up. His red eyes searched around the room, not being able to see through the thick smoke. Finally, he saw the silhouette of Izuku and immediately rushed forward, only for his metal neck to be grabbed. The smoke cleared to show Izuku, the electricity surrounding him now zapping at Metal, causing his software to malfunction. Error, power overload, Metal said, grasping at Izuku's wrist. A buildup of energy appeared at the front of Metal's turbine, a large yellow ball of energy that he planned to launch at Izuku as some sort of plan to get rid of this excess energy. However, before anything else could happen, Robotnik cleared his throat. I've seen all I need. Midoriya, drop Metal Sonic please, Robotnik said. Izuku powered down, gently placing the robot on the ground. Metal looked up at him, and Izuku swore he could see a hint of respect in his red eyes. Geez, this robot is so lifelike, he thought to himself. All right, Metal, go charge yourself, you deserve it, Robotnik said, and Metal looked somewhat surprised, before he walked away, arms at his side. Robotnik then walked up to Izuku, hands clasped behind his back. I believe it's time to fill you in on what's going on. Follow me, he ordered, walking away. Izuku walked behind him, looking around as they walked even further down the hallway from before, leading them to a room with a ton of monitors. On each of them was a grinning blue thing. Isuku had to admit that he was confused. What even was going on here? Robotnik seemed to sense his confusion as he gestured to the screens. That is Sonic the Hedgehog, the absolute bane of my existence. He has done nothing but destroy my work and attack me. He's a terrorist who uses legendary artifacts to get what he wants and doesn't care what it does to others. He has even recently indoctrinated a child on his side, Robotnik explained, clicking a button. One of the monitors then switched to show Sonic and a fox with two tails dashing through a grassy field. Izuku hummed lightly to himself, seeing that Sonic lived up to his name. He was practically a blur as he sped past robots, using his sharp quills to destroy badniks and free tiny animals. What's with the critters? Izuku asked, making Robotnik freeze for a second. They power my machines, he said. Izuku's eyes widened before he glared at the doctor. That sounds incredibly immoral, he commented, and the doctor narrowed his eyes behind his thick glasses. Do not question my methods or my morals. I do what I do for the good of us. Sometimes you need to crack a few eggs to make an omelet, the man responded. Izuku's eyes widened before he scowled. Excuse me, he asked, taking a step forward. The doctor stared, unimpressed, before he scoffed. Do not fool around with me, boy, he said, turning back to the monitors. Izuku's scowl deepened before he shook his head. Sorry, Robotnik, but I don't work like that. I won't help you hurt animals so you can create your weird futuristic society, Izuku said, and he hid a wince as the doctor just stared at him. Fine, leave, the doctor said, turning back to the monitors. Izuku was silent for a moment before he activated OFA and sped away. He was about to look for a way out when he heard someone. He skidded to a stop, and he heard the voice gasp in fear before going silent. He looked around, confused. Why was someone here, and why were they scared? Were they scared of him? Hello, is someone here? I swear I won't hurt you, Izuku said, looking around. He heard another gasp and turned to face where it came from. His eyes widened as he saw an innocent pair of bright green eyes staring at him in fear and shock from a small slot in a reinforced door. He heard another gasp as the person inside backed away, and Izuku walked up to the door, getting to his knees and looking inside. He couldn't see much as it was dark inside, but he could see a small figure curled up into a ball looking at him fearfully. Memories of a small horned girl filled his head, and he immediately knew he had to comfort this person. Hey, you in there, are you all right? He asked, and the figure flinched, whimpering in fear. I don't want to hurt you. Can you please talk to me? He asked, and the figure just stared. They didn't trust him, and he couldn't blame them for that. Just who were they, and why was Robotnik keeping them here? Did Robotnik kidnap you? I don't work for him. I'm actually trying to find my way out of here, he said, and the figure stopped shaking in fear before they nodded. Do you know why he kidnapped you? He asked, and he saw the figure shake their head before they opened their mouth. Can you please get me out of here? The figure whimpered. From the sound of the voice, Izuku deduced that it was a female, reminding him even more of Eri. Hold on, I'm gonna get you out of there, he started, only to be interrupted. Danger sense flared and he ducked under a flying kick from Metal Sonic that probably would have knocked him unconscious, or worse. What the? Why are you here? He asked, and the robot simply glared at him. Look, I'm just trying to leave. I have nothing to do with you, he said as he stood up, immediately charging up to 30% power. Besides, you can't beat me. You remember what happened last time? Izuku asked. Metal Sonic's eyes glowed brighter. Last time, you were on my side, Metal said, before careening forward with unparalleled speed. Izuku jumped out of the way, kicking at Metal, who grabbed his ankle with his razor-sharp claws. Izuku grit his teeth, using both float and gearshift to lift himself up, before crashing down with an axe kick, hitting Metal in the top of his head and glitching him. Metal dropped Izuku, stepping backwards, holding his bow-shaking head. At fatal ROR, shutting down. The robot stuttered before falling to the floor. Izuku sighed, temporarily letting his guard down. He then walked over to the slot, looking inside to see the girl shivering again, staring at something behind him. He then felt something slam into his back, and he screamed in pain, feeling his back crack. He fell to his knees, a sharp pain spreading throughout his entire body. He tried to stand up, but his back audibly protested, and Izuku groaned again. What an utter disappointment you are. You were filled to the brim with potential. I took you in. I gave you clothes and a place to sleep. I even upgraded your battle wear. And this is how you treat me. Robotnik screamed, standing inside a flying vehicle. Metal Sonic, reboot all systems, Robotnik said, turning to the fallen robot, who twitched. After a second of silence, the Robotnik logo appeared on the robot's visor. REBOOTING all systems. A more lifeless version of Metal's voice droned, before he flinched awake, his eyes glowing a dull red. Robotnik's eyes narrowed at the large dent in Metal's head, glaring at him. Perhaps I'll need to add pain receptors to you, Metal, It might give you more motivation to win, Robotnik said coldly. Isuku swore he saw Metal Sonic flinch. Bah, no matter. Metal, grab the traitor and throw him in the cell. I'll deal with him another time. Sonic's nearing the next zone, and I need to greet him with a warm welcome, the doctor said, grinning as he flew down the hallway. Metal Sonic turned his glare to Isuku, who feebly attempted to get back to his feet, his body still unfunctional. Metal Sonic stood up, walking over to Isuku, his eyes lighting up in digital anger. Izuku coughed as Metal Sonic kicked him in the stomach repeatedly, before grabbing him by the throat, lifting him up with a single hand. You're only alive because the doctor permits it, fleshbag, the robot said, before opening the door, the light leaking into the room. Izuku clutched at the metallic wrist, tilting his head to the side to see a small pink hedgehog that looked similar to Sonic scoot backward, curling into herself as she looked up, fearful. That was the girl that he had tried to talk to. Izuku grit his teeth, looking back at Metal Sonic in anger. Keeping innocent people in cages. You people disgust me, Izuku said, getting interrupted by Metal thrusting his fist back into Izuku's stomach, before he tossed him into the cold room. The hedgehog girl yelped as Izuku landed right behind the cage. Izuku grit his teeth as he tried to stand up once more, only for nothing to happen once more. Metal stared on, his bright red eyes glaring hatefully, before he closed the door, walking away. Izuku glared at the door hatefully. He had only been here for a day ... and he already hated this place. Amy stared at the boy in fear and horror, her body pale. She shivered as she looked at the rage he held in his piercing green eyes. She flinched when he looked towards her, anger still shining in his eyes. She backed up further, and the boy simply grunted softly, attempting to reposition himself, only to grit his teeth in pain once again. She whimpered, closing her eyes and imagining her family back home. She would see them again ... She would. She knew she would. Sonic would come and save her, and then they would get married. Yes, that was her destiny. Her tarot cards told her so, and they'd never led her astray before. Sure, she was kidnapped because she came to this stupid planet, but eventually, she would see the sun and forget all about everything that happened. At least, that's what she told herself. She looked down to her now dirty white sneakers, shivering as the boy finally got to his knees, but he looked like he was really struggling. He attempted to get back up into his feet again, only to fall and his face on the ground hard. He hissed, shaking his head on the ground, and Amy winced at the trip. After a second, he tried again, and Amy couldn't stop herself from asking a question. Why do you keep trying? She asked. The boy turned to face her, eyes narrowed. He was silent for a second, before he tried to push himself up again. Because I can't ... stay here. I have to find a way to get out of here. I have to get back home, the boy said, once again falling. But it won't work ... You're not going to be able to do it, Amy whispered, and the boy clenched his fists, glaring at the girl. You don't know me, he spat. You don't know who I am or what I can do, so just shut up and let me concentrate, he said, panting in exertion. Amy flinched, before curling in herself. I am sorry. Please don't hurt me, she whimpered, looking at him, afraid. Izuku's eyes softened as he looked at his cellmate. She looked like she had been here for days, maybe even weeks. Izuku took a breath, before shaking his head softly. Sorry about that. I'm new to this place, Izuku said, looking back at the pink hedgehog girl. I shouldn't have yelled at you like that, he said, and the girl looked up in surprise, before she seemed to be contemplating something. After a second, she scooted over to the edge of the cage, looking at him. And my name's Amy Rose ... What's yours? She asked, a hopeful twinge to her voice. Izuku paused for a second, before answering. Midoriya. Izuku Midoriya, he said. Amy smiled shakily at him, seemingly excited to finally have company. Why were you out here, Izuku? Amy asked, and Izuku cringed at being called by his first name, but was too tired and in pain to care. Robotnik wanted me to work with him, and I found his use of animals disturbing, Izuku said, and Amy's eyes narrowed. Animals? She asked, offended. Izuku choked on air, before shaking his head. The ones that power his badniks, I think they're called, he clarified, and Amy sat back down, a confused frown on her face. You mean flickies? She asked. Izuku looked at her. They power Eggman's robots, she continued. Eggman? Izuku asked. That's what Sonic calls Robotnik, and now everyone calls him that. Eggman himself even started calling himself that, she explained. Izuku nodded, before addressing the other question. If flickies power his robots, then yes, I'm talking about them, he responded. Amy giggled, looking at him. You really aren't from around here, huh? She asked. Izuku winced, shaking his head. Where are you from? She then asked. Izuku paused. Japan, he said, and Amy tilted her head. Japan? I've never heard of a place like that, Amy said, and Izuku froze. What? You've never heard of Japan? But everybody knows Japan. Next thing you're gonna tell me is that you know what quirks are, Izuku said, rolling his eyes at the stupidity of that idea. Amy simply stared at him. Oh, you've gotta be kidding me, he said, closing his eyes. Amy looked down, tapping her fingers together nervously. Sorry, I can't help you all that much, she said, and Izuku winced, feeling guilty. No, you don't need to apologize for anything. I just need to find out where I am. Am I in America? He asked, and Amy raised an eyebrow. America? She asked, giving Izuku his answer. Ugh, just where am I? He asked, mostly to himself. Little planet, Amy responded, looking at him curiously. Izuku looked back, eyes wide. I'm sorry, did you say little planet? Is that like a base or something? He asked. Amy looked at him like he was an alien. What? No, we're on little planet. You know ... the planet? She asked. Izuku's jaw dropped, disbelief apparent. I'm on a different planet, he asked, and Amy covered her ears. Yes, geez, she said, rubbing her ears. Izuku winced again. Sorry, he said. I can't believe I'm not on Earth. Do you know where Earth is? He asked. Amy sucked a breath in through her teeth, looking at him with pity. You're really not gonna like what I'm about to tell you, Izuku, she said. Izuku groaned, putting his head to the ground. Amy giggled again, and Izuku glared at her. Sorry, you're just really funny, she said. Izuku grumbled and looked at the girl. I can't believe that Basta ... jerk Robotnik would capture a child ... Just how long have you been in here, anyways? Izuku asked, making Amy narrow her eyes at him. Child, I'm almost 16, she responded. Yikes, wait, you're 15, but you look so. He trailed off. It's the skirt, I know, she said, arms crossed. It's more ... your entire look, honestly. The skirt definitely helps, but so does the shirt and the shoes, he said, making the girl grab onto the bars, a vein popping out of her head. Hey, I'll have you know that my mother says my sense of style is very beautiful, she said, before turning away, arms crossed. Izuku cringed, looking at the girl. I guess her childishness helps too, Izuku thought, a drop of sweat rolling down the side of his head. Amy turned back to him, still crossing her arms and pouting. However, she quickly got bored of the silence and looked at him curiously again. So ... what's up with the clothes? She asked. Izuku looked at her, before looking down at them. What about them? He asked. Amy winced, not wanting to offend. Oh ... they're a bit ... strange, she asked. Izuku's eyes widened, before he frowned at her. No, they aren't, he said, defending his costume. You're wearing a dark green bodysuit with nearly shoulder-length gloves, she told him, deadpan. Izuku looked away. PSH ... you're wearing gloves too, he said weakly. Amy looked down at her dirty gloves, and looked back up, unimpressed. All Mobians wear gloves. It's considered ... lewd to not wear gloves or shoes in public, she said. Izuku coughed, looking up. Lewd. Not wearing gloves is lewd, he asked. And shoes, she added with a hum. Izuku shook his head. That's interesting, he said, before his eyes widened. Also, Mobians, he asked, looking at her curiously. Wow, really? You don't even know what Mobians are? Amy asked, genuinely surprised. Izuku shook his head, and Amy was well and truly stumped. Well, I'm a Mobian, and so is Sonic, she said, smiling. Izuku nodded, coming to a conclusion. So, a Mobian is a humanoid with animal-like features? He asked. Amy winced, looking at him strangely. Well, yes ... but that's a pretty offensive way of saying it. I know you're not trying to offend, so I'm not mad, but I don't think you can explain to everyone that you're not from around here, so just ... don't compare Mobians to animals, she told him, and his eyes widened. I apologize. Thank you for making me aware, he said. Amy hummed, looking at him with a frown. You really don't know anything about this place, do you? She asked, and Izuku winced. No, I don't, he admitted. Amy nodded, before smiling at him and crossing her arms with a smile. Well, I can teach you, she said, and Izuku perked up. Really? He asked, a smile on his face. After you get some rest. Your back is obviously a little banged up, she said, waving her hand. Izuku hummed, nodding, before Amy gasped. Oh no, I don't have a pillow for you, she said. Izuku chuckled to himself, shaking his head. Amy then smiled, reaching over and grabbing her own pillow and stuffing it through the bars. Izuku waved his hands, denying it, but she still dropped it next to him. It's fine. You're injured anyways, so you need it more than me, she said. Izuku sighed and picked it up to give it back, only to flinch as something sharp poked into his finger. It was too dark to see what poked him though, so he spread 5% of OFA through his arm to light up the area around him, deadpanning at the bundle of pink quills sticking out of the pillow. Whoa ... how the heck are you doing that? She asked. Izuku ignored her for a second, before he sighed, grabbing one of the quills with his index finger and thumb. The quill sparked with pink energy, shocking Izuku, making him drop the pillow and making Amy raise an eyebrow. What ... did you do? She asked, confused. Izuku looked at the quill, eyes wide. I don't know. It just happened. It's like One for all just ... took some energy from the quill. He muttered, and Amy tilted her head. One for all? She asked. Izuku froze, slowly turning to face her. Is this how All Might felt when I saw his true form? He thought to himself. Listen to me, Rose. You cannot tell anyone about that, okay? He said. Amy smiled teasingly. Oh, does someone have a secret? She asked. Izuku's eyes narrowed, and Amy realized that he was dead serious. Oh, you mean it. Of course, you have my word, she said, putting her hand over her chest. Izuku looked her in the eye, seeing nothing but honesty in her bright green eyes, and sighed. Thank you, he sighed, before looking back at the pillow. He slowly reached over, spreading his fingers over the pillow. The dozen quills that weren't touched bristled, vibrating slightly. Izuku lowered his hand so that it was just barely hovering over the quills, and a bolt of pink energy zapped his hand. The energy made him flinch and drop his hand. Izuku grit his teeth as he spasmed, the dozen quills shooting energy directly into his body. Amy gasped, looking at him in concern. Are you okay? She asked. Izuku grit his teeth before the energy died down. Izuku panted, his hair standing on end. He looked at his glove, seeing absolutely no damage. What the hell? He muttered. Izuku, are you all right? Answer me, she asked, scared for her new cellmate. Yes, I'm fine. I think I feel better than before, he said, before shifting, attempting to push himself up again. Wait, you're gonna hurt yourself again, she said, only for Izuku to get onto his knees with little struggle. He looked down in surprise, before he tried to get onto his knees, flinching at the sharp pain in his back. It still hurt ... but not nearly as much as before. Slowly but surely, he got to his feet, Amy watching in surprise. You did it. Good job, she said, smiling at him. Izuku smiled under his mask, before he took a deep breath and placed his hand to his back, wincing as he felt that something was definitely sticking out more than it should have been. Izuku stopped, closing his eyes. Fuck, he whispered. Amy raised an eyebrow, surprised at the crude language. Whoa, are you all right? She asked. Izuku nodded, stabling himself. Yeah, something in my back is dislocated though, so I'm going to have to relocate it. Amy winced, looking at him in sympathy. She remembered when she dislocated her ankle while playing at the park when she was younger. She could still remember how much it hurt to reset the bone. Oh God, I'm sorry. Do you need help? I have some medical training, she said. Izuku shook his head, looking at her as he winced. And no, I can do it myself. You might want to cover your ears though, he said. She nodded, doing as she was told, and he took a deep breath before lowering his mask, making Amy's eyes widen. A strand of black whip slithered out of his shoulder and extended to the front of his mouth. He bit down on it, making sure that he had something to ground him and lower the noise he would make. He then used 5% of OFA in only his legs and jumped backwards into one of the thick metal walls. Tears stung at his eyes as he cried into the thick strand of black whip. He clenched his fists and closed his eyes as he did it again. This time, a loud crack echoed throughout the room, and Amy winced. She could even hear it through her covered ears. After a minute or two of cursing into the black whip strand, Izuku fell to one knee, the ethereal energy whip retracting back into his body. Amy looked at him in concern for a minute as he panted, wiping his eyes. Are you all right? She asked. Izuku nodded, stretching slightly and sighing when he felt no pain from it. Yes, sorry about that, he said. Good, that looked like it really hurt, and I'm glad you fixed it. Now, I have a few questions, Amy said, looking at him, surprisingly stoic. Izuku gathered himself for a few more moments, before nodding at her. Go ahead, he said. First, you're a human, she said, and Izuku chuckled tiredly. That's not a question, he responded, and Amy shrugged. Second, what was that weird black stuff you bit down on? She asked. A strand of black whip shot out of his back, forming a hand and waving at her. She waved back, and he smiled. That's black whip. I can form it into any shape I want and shoot it out of any part of my body, and thanks to a friend, it can even go through my clothes without tearing them, he explained. Amy nodded. Right, makes sense. Third, what does Kyuso mean? She asked, and Izuku blushed. A bad word, he said. Amy raised an eyebrow. I'm 15, not 8. I've heard bad words before, she told him, and Izuku shrugged. It means shit in my language, he said, and Amy's eyes widened. Oh, it's a bad word, she said, and Izuku facepalmed. I'm just kidding, Amy said, a smile on her face. Izuku dragged his hand off of his face, amused. So ... what exactly is one for all? She asked, and Izuku winced, knowing that the question was coming. Izuku looked around for cameras, spotting one quickly. He looked to see if there was a microphone, humming when he didn't see one. It used to be a secret at my home, but ... well, let's just say the majority of people know about it. So I guess I don't mind telling you about it ... but you're probably gonna be pretty confused unless I tell you about my world, he said. Amy shrugged. We have time, she responded. Izuku smiled. He always loved explaining the things he cared about, even if most people stopped listening after 5 minutes. Well, it all started a little over 200 years ago, when a certain glowing baby was born. He started. It had been at least 4 hours since Isuku had started explaining his story, and Amy was still listening intently. It wasn't her fault Izuku's world was so interesting. She expected him to get bored of explaining, or simply summarize the one-for-all part, but he just kept going about the different types of powers that existed in his world. So, there's 3 types of quirks, right? She asked. Izuku, who was giving a brief explanation on how some emitter quirks were actually mutant quirks, paused before nodding. So what type of quirk would I have? She asked. Without a second of hesitation, Izuku responded. You'd be considered a mutant, he said, and she nodded with a smile. I thought so. It's because of the hedgehog parts, right? She asked, and Izuku nodded with a smile. Exactly. I'm surprised you followed for so long. I haven't even gotten to my life yet, and you're still listening to me ramble, he said with a genuine smile. Amy tilted her head, looking confused. How is that surprising? She asked, and Izuku rubbed the back of his head. Well, most people just listen to me for a few minutes before they leave. I've been told that I talk too much or that I'm annoying many times, Izuku said. Amy gasped, covering her mouth. What? That's so mean, she said, and Izuku shrugged, looking down with a sad frown on his face. It's whatever. I understand why people get upset at me for talking so much, he said, and Amy shook her head. That doesn't mean they have to be so rude about it. Just because you're passionate about the things you care about doesn't mean you're annoying, she said, crossing her arms. Izuku looked at her with wide eyes, before he cleared his throat, ignoring how dry it was. Well, I'm kinda tired. How about I continue the story tomorrow? He asked. Amy nodded, yawning. That sounds like a plan. I'm actually pretty tired myself, she said, stretching. She stopped when she heard something soft land behind her, turning around to see her pillow, quills still stuck inside. She looked up to see Izuku smiling at her before he laid down. Wait, I gave this to you though. You need it more than me, she said, and Izuku wagged his finger. It reminded her of Sonic, and she blushed. What about your back? She asked, flustered. Fixed it, remember. Just take the pillow, Rose. It's fine. I've slept under way worse conditions, trust me. Besides, I'm way more durable than most people, he said, and Amy's blush deepened. Why do you keep calling me Rose? She asked, and Izuku paused. Oh, yeah, back where I live, you only called somebody by their first name if you were really close with them. Otherwise, you called them by their last name. It's the, respectful way to do things back in Japan, he explained, and Amy nearly went catatonic. Why, you mean I've been disrespecting you this entire time, and you didn't tell me? She asked. Izuku winced, and Amy groaned. Oh, I'm really sorry, Midoriya, she said. Izuku shook his head, chuckling. Don't worry, I'm not gonna make you do something that you're not used to. I don't mind people using my first name. I can call you Amy too if you want, he told her, and she peeked at him from over her knees. Really? But isn't it weird for you? She asked, and Izuku smiled. Nah, I call plenty of people by their first names. Don't worry about it, Amy, he said, and she smiled. Thank you, Izuku, she responded, before lying down. Izuku also laid down, folding his hands under his head. After a minute, he heard his cellmate's soft snores, and smiled, quickly falling asleep soon after. Maybe this place isn't all bad, he thought, before he fell into a dreamless sleep. Izuku shifted when he heard someone whisper his name, before opening his eyes when he heard a tray slide towards him. He sat up, holding his head as he looked over at Amy, who was smiling kindly at him. He looked down to see a small tray of food, with about half of the food eaten, based on how large the tray was. There wasn't a lot of food to begin with. He looked up at Amy, concerned. This is all you've been eating since you've been in here? He asked. Amy shrugged, looking away. It's filling, she said, holding onto her arms. Izuku looked down at the food, conflicted. He was hungry, but he didn't want to take Amy's already scarce food. Izuku looked down at the tray, before he sighed, taking the small roll of bread and a few grapes. He then slid the tray back to the cage, making Amy's eyes widen. She shook her head, glaring at Izuku. You need that food more than I do. You're way bigger than me, she said, and Izuku bit into the bread, grimacing at the hardness of it. Great, stale bread. Izuku sighed, swallowing the less than appetizing food. So you've been eating stale bread, fruits, and a small glass of water every day? Izuku asked, and Amy nodded. Yeah, it's not much, but at least I'm being fit. I'm surprised they didn't give you some food, she said, looking over at the metal door, similar to the one he broke. Izuku stared at the door, taking another bite of his bread, before walking over to the door. He activated OFA and poked at the door, eyes widening when it dented it. Izuku deadpanned before he got an idea. He smiled, walking over to Amy's cage, who was staring at him curiously. I've got an idea that can get us both out of here. but we need to wait for Metal Sonic to come over here to enact it. First through, I think it's about time you got out of that cage, Isuku said, grabbing the bars. Scooch back, Amy. If these bars break, I don't want any of them hitting you, he said, and Amy did as she was told, confused. Why would the bars break? How are you gonna get me out of here? Amy asked, hope slipping into her voice. Izuku smiled at her, sparks dancing across his body. Watch and learn, Amy, he said, before he pulled on the bars. The sound of metal screeching echoed throughout the room as the bars bent, and Amy stared in awe as an opening wide enough for her to step through was created, and she quickly did so, looking at the cage from the outside. Sonic can't do that, she thought to herself, awestruck. Izuku then bent the bars back into their original position. Before looking around the cage, he smiled at one of the longer and thicker bars, before he grabbed it, twisting it enough so that it snapped off. He then pulled on the other side, quickly snapping that off as well. He held the bar in his hands, before handing it to Amy, who held it, shocked. A weapon, if you need it. I hope it doesn't come down to that, but you can never be too prepared, Izuku said. Amy stared at Izuku, tears pricking at her eyes, before she dropped the pipe and jumped at Izuku, enveloping him in a hug. Izuku stepped backwards in surprise as tears stained his costume. He stood still for a second, before he gently wrapped his arms around Amy, still a bit surprised. She then looked up, tears flowing down her face. Thank you, she said, and Izuku smiled, a drop of sweat running down his face. Of course, he said, before he set Amy down. Amy stretched, bending her back and exhaling when a multitude of cracks were heard. Oh, that's the good stuff, she muttered, doing another series of stretches, and Izuku watched in surprise as she displayed a level of flexibility he hadn't even thought possible. After she was finished, she looked up to see Izuku staring at her, eyes wide and mouth partly open. She blushed, embarrassed. What? She asked. Izuku scratched the back of his head. You're really flexible, he said, still a bit surprised at the sight. Amy huffed, crossing her arms. Yeah, and? She asked, looking at him with a raised eyebrow. Izuku put his hands up placatingly. It was just an observation, he said. She smiled at him, sticking her tongue out. Gotcha, she said, and Izuku deadpanned. You sure you're 15? He asked, and she glared at him, a vein popping out of her head. What was that? She asked, voice dangerously sweet. Izuku chuckled nervously. Nothing, he said. She hummed, before looking back at Izuku. So ... can you continue your story? She asked. Izuku looked at her, smiling. Oh yeah, he said. You know how I said that 94% of human children are born with a quirk? He asked. Amy nodded, listening intently. Well, the chance is minuscule, but ... you can be born without a quirk. You'd have to be really unlucky for it to happen to you ... and I was never really the lucky type, he said, and Amy tilted her head. Are you saying ... that you were born without a quirk, but ... you have one? That one for all thingy, Amy said, confused. Izuku nodded, lifting his arm as it lit up with sparks. Yep, however, I wasn't born with this quirk. I was born quirkless ... and it was ... an experience, Izuku said, zoning out for a minute, a frown on his face. Amy looked at him, concerned as he cleared his throat. Sorry about that. Anyways, one day, when I was walking home from school, I was attacked by a villain made out of sludge, Izuku explained. Amy nodded, having learned what heroes and villains were near the beginning of his story. He tried to drown me and take over my body, and me being quirkless, I didn't really stand a chance. Luckily, the #1 hero, All Might, stepped in to save me. I hadn't ever seen him in person before, but I was a huge fan, Izuku said, smiling fondly at the memory. After he saved me, I asked him if I could be a hero without a quirk. He ... he said no. He told me about how he had gotten gravely injured years ago, and it was so bad that they had to remove his stomach and one of his lungs. It was so bad that he could only use his quirk for 3 hours a day. And that if the strongest man in the world could nearly die in a fight like that, then I really stood no chance. It hurt, but I knew he was trying to protect me. Still, I had wanted to be a hero all my life, and hearing that I couldn't from my idol, I had nearly given up that day, Izuku explained, his smile fading. Amy nodded, feeling sympathy for her new friend. However, All Might had dropped the bottle that contained the sludge villain, and it broke out, taking someone else hostage. All Might couldn't do anything about it, because he had already used up his 3 hours, but I rushed in. I threw my bag at the villain's eye and tried to get the hostage out. I failed, but my heroic actions inspired All Might, and he pushed himself past his limits and punched the villain so hard that the weather changed, Izuku explained, enigmatic in his storytelling. Amy's eyes widened as she listened, leaning forward in anticipation as Izuku continued the story. After that whole debacle, All Might stopped me on my way home, telling me what I had done for him that day, before he made me a proposition that would change my life forever. He told me of a legendary quirk that had been passed down through generations, And that quirk was, Izuku said, looking at Amy, who perked up. One for all, she asked, and Izuku smiled, nodding. Exactly. All Might had chosen me to be the 9th wielder of OFA, so I trained. I trained so hard that I passed out due to exhaustion at one point, but All Might was there for me every step of the way. I don't know where I'd be if it wasn't for him, if I'm being honest, Izuku said. Amy smiled at him. He sounds like a great man, she said, and Izuku's smile grew sorrowful. Yeah, he was, he said, softly. Amy's cringed, looking at him sympathetically. Oh, I'm sorry, she said. Izuku waved her off, shaking his head. It's all right. He passed a little over a year ago. It was especially hard because my mother had also passed at around that time. With both of them gone, I was lost for a while, and I did things that I'm not very proud of, Izuku admitted, looking down at his hands. Amy looked up at him, feeling bad for the guy. Well, you seem to have grown from that point, considering you're admitting that what you did was wrong, she said. Izuku looked at her, surprised, before he shook his head. No, you don't understand. I hurt people, a lot of people. I went overboard most of the time, often sending criminals to hospitals rather than jail. I secluded myself from a lot of people and ignored their pleas for me to just talk to them. Not only did I physically hurt some people to the point of no return, I also emotionally hurt so many of my friends. Just because I grew as a person doesn't mean that what I didn't do all those things, Izuku said, staring down at the ground, eyes narrowed in anger at himself. Amy shook her head, staring at him with a determined frown. But you're trying to atone, right? You shouldn't be so hard on yourself, she tried, but Izuku shook his head. Just drop it, he said. Amy opened her mouth, but Izuku shot her a pleading look. Please, he said. Amy closed her mouth, looking at him, before she sighed. All right, she said. Suddenly, the two heard the now familiar metallic stomps. Izuku's eyes narrowed, and he slipped his mask and rebreather on. He's coming, Amy said, shivering, her eyes dilated. Izuku looked at her, in battle mode, and smiled under his mask. Don't worry, I won't let anything happen to you, Amy, he said, and she looked up at him, before she nodded shaky. Follow my lead, he whispered as Metal Sonic stopped in front of the door. Izuku led Amy the corner of the room, where they wouldn't be seen. Sure enough, the slot opened, and a pair of glowing eyes looked through the slot. What? He asked, before the door opened with a hiss. Izuku grabbed Amy, telling her to be quiet. She nodded, and Izuku used float to levitate, before he activated OFA at 20% and kicked the door with both feet. It flew off of its hinges, slamming into the unaware Metal Sonic, and sending him through multiple walls. Izuku grinned, rushing out the door, still holding Amy. Do you know the way out of here? Izuku asked, and she shook her head. Izuku hummed, before zipping off at incredibly high speeds. Amy yelped, burying her face into Izuku to stop the wind whipping at her face. Izuku raced through the building, looking for an exit, before skidding to a stop in the monitor room. He looked at all the cameras, seeing that Sonic was speeding through the same base that they were standing in. Izuku grinned, placing Amy on the ground as she took a few wobbly steps around. So dizzy, she said, nearly falling, but catching herself before she could trip. With a quick blur of power, every single one of the monitors was smashed, glass shattering and exploding. There, now he won't be able to see what Sonic's getting up to, he said, hoping that Robotnik was lying about Sonic, and that he was actually a hero. Suddenly, danger sense pinged, and Izuku somersaulted over Amy, blocking an attack from Metal Sonic that probably would have hit her. You insufferable wretch, do you know what is going to happen to me because of you? Metal asked, and Izuku kneed the damaged robot. It was clear that the metallic copy had taken some damage from the door, as his chassis was dented, and his visor was cracked. His left arm hung limp, and one of his eye LEDs was out. That sounds like a heaping pile of not my problem, Izuku replied, jumping and kicking Metal in the head, sending him flying backwards. Before Metal could get up, Black Whip rushed out from his back, wrapping around Metal's wrists and ankles. Metal struggled, his singular lit eye blazing with rage and desperation. Look, I don't want to have to do this. You surrender, and I'll let you go. Robotnik will repair you, and Izuku started, only for Metal to roar. You don't understand. You don't know what it's like, being his little lapdog. You don't know what he'll do to me if I fail, he screamed, struggling as his rotor roared to life. Izuku was silent, staring at him with wide eyes. He'll take me apart. He'll erase me. I don't want to be disassembled, but you have done nothing but guarantee that. You humiliate me in front of him, beat me in a fight, and now I let you escape. I don't want to die, Metal screamed, and Izuku's eyes widened, stunned. Why, you can come with us, a timid voice shouted. Izuku looked backwards, and Metal looked past him to see Amy looking at her, her hands clasped together. She was obviously terrified of Metal, yet she still offered to save him from his fate. The fate that he didn't choose. Izuku looked at Amy, lowering his guard, and lightening his grip on Metal Sonic, who looked down, breaking his wrist out of the trap. He reared his claws back, and they glinted in the light. Amy gasped, and Izuku's danger sense warned him. But it was too late. Metal Sonic slashed Izuku's face, and he screamed in pain, tripping backwards as he nursed his new wound. Metal fell to the ground, landing on his chest. He slowly pushed himself up. Izuku held his hand to his cheek and pulled it back to see his glove covered in blood. He bit his cheek to stop himself from screaming. He reached into his utility belt, pulling some antiseptic bandages, and taking off his rebreather, which now had 4 long gashes in them, same with his cheek. He then wrapped the bandages around his cheeks and jaws, and around the back of his head. He flinched as he tied the bandage, clipping it together, before reapplying his mask. He cried out as Metal Sonic stomped on his wrist, making him drop the bandages. He glared disdainfully as Metal Sonic leaned over, grabbing Izuku by the throat with his bloody claws. The bloody roll of bandages rolled over to Amy, but she was frozen in fear. She saw Metal gripping Izuku by the neck, his claws digging into his neck. She stood, frozen in fear as Metal Sonic spoke. "No, I don't need your pity, or your mercy. If I'm going out, I'm going to go out as Sonic. Not some loathsome copy, but the real Sonic." Metal screamed, madness visible in his digital eyes. Metal squeezed. Amy blinked. Why was she in front of her new friend? Had she run here? She didn't remember doing that. Why was she holding some strange mallet? She'd never seen it, but it looked like it was made for her. The handle and faces of the mallet were bright orange, whilst the head and neck of the mallet were green. It fit into her hands perfectly, and she felt more confident using it. She scowled at Metal, and he paused as he looked at her. "I offered you a chance, and you wasted it. Now you're hurting my friend. Fuck you and your stupid master," she yelled, swinging the massive hammer that was surprisingly light in her hands, smashing Metal Sonic in his face, crumpling it like a soda can. Metal let go, stumbling backwards and onto his back. Amy panted, before she came to her senses, dropping the hammer as it disappeared into sparkles. She then turned to face. Izuku quickly got up to his feet, Amy grabbing him by the arm and asking if he was okay. He nodded, wordlessly, unclipping his rebreather, showing her the bandages and motioning that he wasn't going to be able to speak for now. She nodded, before Izuku powered up again. However, it was different. Instead of the lighting becoming more pronounced, he and his costume just got bigger. His body became more muscular, but not by much. He simply got a bit bulkier, and sped off. However, for some reason the lightning surrounding him had a very small pink outline to it. Izuku ran, having powered up to 50%, but he was so adrenaline-filled that he didn't even notice the fact that he was slower by a fairly small margin. But a margin nonetheless. He dashed towards Metal Sonic, who had stumbled to his feet, his entire body shaking. His body sparked, and despite his body involuntarily shaking, he put up a shaky guard. I've stuff-eyed him on our fights, and diagnosed that the amount of electricity around him dictates how strong he currently is. I should be able to defend myself, or at least hold them off until the doctor comes, Metal thought, before he was interrupted. Izuku rushed forward, and slammed his fist into Metal's stomach. Metal's durable rotor folded in half like paper as Izuku's fist went straight through him as if he were made out of a cloud. However, he was not unscathed. His arm seemed to rupture on the inside, bits of bone sticking out of his now dark purple arm. The costume simply stretched around the bone, and Izuku screamed in pain, stepping back and fully powering down. Metal stood there, stunned as he looked down, his single working lead eye sparking, before shutting down. Metal fell to the ground, slowly rebooting. Izuku stepped back, nearly stumbling if it wasn't for Amy catching him. "JG's, you're heavy," she complained, trying her best to not look at his bloody costume. She helped him stand on his own 2 feet, before Black Whip wrapped around his arm, acting as a cast. "Let's go," he grit, stumbling forward. They needed to get out of here before the doctor returns. He was out of the fight, and Amy couldn't fight the doctor. He stumbled forwards, falling to his knees. He looked up, seeing the doctor, covered in soot, flying towards them. His face was tight in rage, and he was glaring at Izuku and Amy with shock and anger. "You, how did you get out?" he screamed. Izuku looked up, ready to retort, before he exhaled, falling limp. Amy looked at him in fear that he had died from blood loss, but he was still breathing. He had just passed out. She looked up to see Eggman chuckling, looking at Amy with a grin. "It looked like your luck has run out, you slippery little rat," Eggman yelled, flying towards him, only for a blue blur to slide in front of them, glaring at Eggman, who froze, before he grit his teeth, face red in anger. He slammed his fist on the control panel of his Eggmobile, denting it heavily. "Damn you, Sonic," Eggman yelled, flying off down the hallway, leaning out the vehicle and grabbing Metal Sonic as he flew off. Once they couldn't hear the sound of his vehicle anymore, Sonic turned to face Amy. "Are you all right, girlie?" he asked, instead of simply crossing her arms and pouting or something. The girl immediately went over to the weirdly dressed guy with a pretty nasty injury. "Yes, I'm fine, but he's really hurt. We need to get out of here." she yelled, grabbing Isuku and struggling to lift him by the shoulder. Sonic sped over, helping her and letting the strange guy hang on their shoulders. "Who's the guy?" Sonic asked, and Amy looked at him, face serious. "Where's your plane?" she asked, and his eyes widened. "The tornado. Tails is with it, said he wants to see it," Sonic explained. "Well then call Tails, and tell him to fly over here," Amy ordered. Sonic flinched, looking over at the guy. He didn't want blood in the tornado. "Well, what are you waiting for? You're supposed to be fast," Amy yelled, growing irritated. Sonic winced, looking at Amy weirdly. "What happened to you?" Sonic started, only to be interrupted by Amy. "Oh my god, just call your friend or let me do it. My friend is bleeding out. We don't have the time for this," Amy screamed, and Sonic finally pulled out a strange walkie-talkie, clicking the button. "Tails, it's Sonic. I'm gonna need you to fly the plane to my coordinates. I'll share them now," he said into the walkie-talkie. Amy heard a voice faintly speak back before Sonic closed the connection. "Thank you," Amy said, nodding. Sonic gave her a thumbs up, and she blushed a little bit. Sorry for yelling at you, Sonic," she said, and Sonic shrugged, shaking his head. "No, you were right. I didn't know it was that bad," he said, looking forward. Amy looked down in worry at her heavily injured friend, afraid that he was going to slip at any moment. Sonic and Amy carried Isuku to the outside of the base, where they waited for a few minutes before they saw a plane in the distance, and Sonic grinned. Soon, a half-red, half-blue plane landed in front of them. "Well, what's with the red, buddy?" Sonic asked, and a little fox with a bike helmet and welding goggles looked up, pulling the helmet off and waving to Sonic. Amy cooed slightly at the little fox, who raised an eyebrow. "Who are they?" he asked. "They're with me. Let's get out of here. Just focus on flying the plane for now," Sonic said, he and Amy getting Isuku in the back seat. Sonic sat next to Tails in the co-pilot seat, and Amy sat atop Izuku's legs. Tails made sure not to fly too fast, as Amy couldn't exactly buckle herself up. Within a few hours, they had made it back to Mobius. It was dark out, and Sonic was sleeping. Isuku was still passed out, and Amy and Tails were both tired but awake. Tails landed the plane in front of his and Sonic's cottage. Sonic snapped awake, looking around seeing that they were back at their house. He looked around, seeing a tired and emotionless Amy grab Isuku by the legs, attempting to lift him. She failed at lifting, but successfully pulled him far enough out of the plane that Sonic could help. They began dragging him, only for him to groan, his feet finding their way to the ground. His eyes opened, and he looked around blearily. He saw grassy plains and beautiful waterfalls reflecting the moonlight. Suddenly, he snapped awake, looking around, hyper-aware. Amy," he asked, voice muffled by the bandages, before she answered him. "I'm right here. Sonic got us out of there," she told him. Izuku looked to his other side to see the hedgehog give him a thumbs up along with a small smile. Izuku exhaled, standing up to his full height, flinching as his shattered arm shifted. He took a deep breath before he nodded down at Sonic as thanks. Izuku then unclipped his damaged rebreather, showing off his bandaged mouth. His face was almost entirely covered, except for his eyes. Tails then stumbled over to them, staring up at Izuku with a smile. "You're awake. I prepared some beds for you and Amy in the guest room. You guys can stay here for a bit while I help get you situated," Tails said, leading them into the house. Tails led the exhausted duo to the guest room, and Amy sat down with a sigh. "Thanks, Tails." Amy sighed as she immediately laid down, ready to get a full night of sleep, but Izuku sat down, not quite ready to go to sleep. "Are you sure you're okay, Amy?" Izuku asked, and the hedgehog girl looked at him with a weary smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just yawn really tired," she said, and Izuku smiled, lying down as well and quickly falling asleep. Elsewhere, Metal Sonic finally finished rebooting, and he looked down to see that he was strapped to a metal table. He then saw the doctor walk up to him from the shadows, and he immediately started struggling. "You have failed me, Metal Sonic. Worse, you disappointed me. But don't worry, we'll fix that very soon," the doctor said, grinning. Please," Metal pleaded, voice weak. "Don't it hurts," Metal muttered. But he was ignored, as Robotnik took the main panel on his head off, before digging through it, ignoring his mechanical creation's pained screams. "Don't worry, Metal. You won't remember any of this once I rebuild you. Not a thing. If you fail me again, I'll make sure you never forget," Robotnik said, as he placed a small kill chip inside Metal Sonic's brain. Metal twitched as the virus slowly killed him from the inside, erasing him by the second. The last thought he conceived before he was silent was one of spite. "Midoriya, I will have my revenge."
Izuku startled awake, his body twitching uncomfortably. He looked to the side to see Amy still peacefully snoring, her quills unsorted and messy. He smiled softly at her, before pushing himself to his feet with his remaining good arm. He slowly shuffled out of the guest room, seeing that Sonic was the only other one awake. Sonic swiftly spotted him, and placed his index finger in front of his mouth, pointing to something next to him. Izuku looked to the side to see a bundle of fur and realized with a grin that it was Tails, curled up on himself, his two tails acting as a blanket. He looked like a large kitten. Izuku was about to whisper, only to wince as the bandages were tugged. Oh, right, he thought, before he held up a finger. He then quickly walked out of the house, undoing the bandages and staring at them. They were almost fully soaked through, and his cheek had healed quite the bit from last night. He would probably have to wrap his face in bandages again later, but it was definitely less painful than before. Izuku then walked back inside, the bloodied bandages in his hand. Sonic looked at them, disgust apparent on his features. Sorry, Izuku whispered. Sonic shrugged, putting the comic that he was reading down. As long as you get rid of it without littering or staining something, then I won't have a problem. Sonic whispered back. Izuku nodded, before he bowed lightly. Thank you for letting Amy and I stay the night. I'm going to help her get home today, and after that, I don't know what I'll do. Maybe I'll live near her. I don't know, he whispered. Sonic smirked at him, crossing his arms. You care about her, huh? He teased. Izuku nodded, a melancholy look appearing on his face. She reminds me of someone, he muttered. Sonic nodded with a grin, before it faded away. Say, did you witness anything happen to her while you were there? Sonic asked. Izuku raised an eyebrow, before he shook his head. No, why? She didn't look too hurt, just pretty dirty, Izuku replied. Sonic looked over at Tails, seeing that he was still sleeping, before jumping off of his chair, walking outside, motioning for Izuku to follow. Izuku walked outside after the blue hedgehog, an eyebrow raised. Before that girl was kidnapped, Sonic started. Amy, her name is Amy, Izuku interrupted, and Sonic rolled her eyes. Yeah, before Amy was kidnapped, she she was kind of obsessed with me. She literally wouldn't leave me alone, talking about something or another, before telling me that we were gonna get married. I don't know, I wasn't really listening, Sonic admitted. Izuku nodded, feeling a little weirded out by this. Right, now what happened that made you think she had gone through something? He asked, making Sonic's frown deepen. She was completely different when I rescued her. Instead of fawning over me like she did before, she wouldn't stop checking on you and telling me to hurry it up. She even yelled at me that I was being too slow. I guess there's a first time for everything, Sonic said with a chuckle, rubbing the underside of his nose and putting his hands behind his head. Izuku hummed, looking down to the ground. So, that rotten egg either did something to her, or you had some sort of effect on her, Sonic concluded, and Izuku scoffed. Please, don't tell me you're hinting at me changing her for the better, Izuku said, and Sonic grinned at him. What? Too hard to believe for you? He asked teasingly, only for him to falter as Izuku glared forwards. I've hurt more people than you can imagine, Sonic. People I've cared about. I don't help people. Not anymore, at least, Izuku said, looking down. Sonic raised an eyebrow, looking at him with his arms crossed. You're being dramatic, Sonic said, before a smile appeared on Izuku's smile, but it was obvious to anyone with eyes that it was hollow. You don't know me, Sonic. I'd like to keep it that way. I'm going to go take a shower, Izuku said cryptically, walking back into the house. Sonic stared at him as he meandered away, before shaking his head with a sigh. You can't win them all, Sonic, he muttered to himself. He sounded really sad. A young voice said behind him, startling him and making him turn around with a surprised jump. Oh, you heard all that, Tails? He asked. Tails nodded, eyes downcast. Why does he think of himself like that? Tails asked, and Sonic cringed, not wanting to explain the idea of self-hatred to an 8-year-old. Well, some people some people just don't like themselves, Tails. It's sad, but no matter what some people do, they just can't love themselves. There can be a lot of reasons for this, but our guest seems to think he's a bad person, Sonic explained, making Tails hum sadly. That's really sad, he said. Sonic nodded. Those are the hardest parts of saving someone. Sometimes, people just don't want to be saved, and there isn't anything you can do about it, Sonic explained. What? But Mr. Izuku didn't look like he needed to be saved, Tails asked, tilting his head with confusion. Sonic chuckled, rubbing Tails on the head and making him giggle. You've still got a lot to learn, little buddy, Sonic said with a grin. Amy groaned softly as she stirred, before she awoke. She blinked tiredly before she yawned and stretched. She sat up, scratching at her messy quills. She looked around, blinking in confusion when she didn't see Izuku, though her tired brain was too tired to really process anything. She simply got to her feet and walked out the room to find Tails and Sonic sitting at their table, before they both looked at her. Sonic cringed, plugging his nose. You stink, he said, and Amy immediately snapped back to awareness, scowling. Hey, it's not my fault that I was in a cage for a week. She snapped back, and Sonic raised an eyebrow. Yeah it was. You were the one that followed me. If you weren't doing that, then you probably would have been fine. Sonic countered. Amy winced, blushing. Oh yeah that feels like so long ago, she said softly, and Sonic raised an eyebrow. Speaking of, why haven't you been all over me since I saved you? You wouldn't leave me alone beforehand, Sonic pointed out, and Amy paused. Why hasn't she? She had always seen Sonic as her hero. Now though, he was just a hero. But she loved him, hadn't she? Before she was kidnapped, the only things she felt for Sonic were admiration and was it actually love? Sure, he was cool, and she still admired him, but she just didn't see him as her hero anymore. I don't know. I know I don't feel the same way as before, but I don't know why, she said, and Sonic hummed. Well, that's good. I don't need any girls slobbering over me anytime soon, he said, and Amy glared. I don't slobber. Where's your shower? If I stink so bad then you should be a proper host, Amy yelled, and Sonic cringed. All right, it's right behind you, he said, and Amy nodded, walking over to the room, but pausing before she could enter. Do you guys have a washer? She asked. Sonic snorted, shaking his head. All we wear are shoes and gloves. We wash out stuff by hand, he said as if it were obvious. Amy frowned, looking at him with an annoyed glare before she waved him off. Fine, just know that I'm gonna have to walk around in the nude, she said, and Sonic immediately grimaced in disgust. I'll wash your clothes, geez, he said. Amy walked into the bathroom, waving at him from inside. Thank you, she sang. Sonic grumbled as the shower turned on, and he quickly sped around the house, washing Amy's clothes at super speed, putting them back near the shower. He then sat back down and crossed his legs, picking his comic book back up. Sonic, Tails asked. Sonic peeked over the page. What does in the nude mean? Tails asked innocently. Sonic's eyes widened before he looked back down at the comic, face slightly pink. I'll tell you when you're older, he answered. Tails groaned. You say that all the time, he said, pouting. Well, that's because other people need to learn how to watch their mouth around you. Sonic snapped back. Tails pouted again. Isuku walked through the door and Tails perked up. Mr. Isuku, what doesn't the nude mean? Tails asked, and Isuku choked on his own spit. When Annie walked out of the bathroom with her clothes clean and her mood chipper, she found Isuku back, with his mouth unwrapped. She immediately rushed to him, grabbing onto his shoulder and inspecting the wound. Why, Amy? He asked, startled. She glared at the wound, grumbling. Well, at least it's clean, she muttered. Isuku pulled away from her, looking at her strangely. Maybe a warning next time, Amy, he asked. Amy smiled sweetly back at him. Nope, she said, walking away. Isuku watched her go, confused more than anything. Sonic looked at them before he shook his head, going back to his comic. Amy quickly returned, holding a pink quill in her hands, her eyes closed. She smiled, though her teeth were grit and she seemed to be holding back tears. Amy, are you all right? He asked, looking down in concern. She nodded. Why, yep, fine. Jay, just take this and see if it helps with your arm at all, Amy said, handing him the quill. It sparked in his hand, but he didn't absorb the energy. Izuku took a breath before activating OFA, and he immediately felt the energy in the quill get sucked into him. He relaxed slightly as his arm shifted. He looked down, the quill no longer holding any energy, before his back whip cast slowly disappeared. Izuku winced as he looked at his clothed arm. I don't know if I can take this off on my own, Amy, he said, and Amy grimaced before she nodded. I'll help you. Come on, let's go outside, she said, leading Izuku outside the cottage, where Tails was sitting. He seemed to be relaxing, curled up in a little circle, his face buried in the soft fluff of his tails. Izuku had to cover his mouth to stop himself from blurting the stereotypical awa sound. Amy, however, had to physically restrain herself from going over and petting the fox boy. After she grounded herself, she sat Izuku down, and he swiftly told her how to unclasp his glove. After she slowly dragged the long glove off of his arm, he bit the insides of his cheek to stop himself from making any noises. Amy then looked up at him, eyes serious. This is the hard part, okay Izuku? I just need you to stay still, she said, before slowly sliding his green sleeve up his arm. Tears pricked at Izuku's eyes as he sat there, barely moving. After a second, Izuku let out a shaky exhale, the sleeve all the way up. The good part was that he didn't have shards of bone sticking out of his arm anymore. The bad part, his arm was still a dark purple, and a new spiral scar was now running down his right arm, and he glared at it like it had spat on his mother's grave. Wow that's a lot of scars, Amy said, looking at Izuku's heavily scarred arm. Izuku nodded, teeth grit. Yeah, was all he said. She brushed her finger against his arm accidentally, and Izuku drew a breath in through his teeth, clenching his other fist. Amy flinched, eyes apologetic. Sorry, she said, and Izuku shook his head with a tight smile. It's okay. Izuku grit out, and Amy bit her lip at Izuku's arm, before she smiled at Izuku. I'll be right back. Don't move, she said, and Izuku blinked as she rushed inside. He waited for a second, before someone yelped in pain. Youch. Izuku heard, and Amy rushed back outside, a long blue quill in her hands. Izuku's eyes widened, and he narrowed his eyes at Amy. Amy, you can't just do that, he said. Amy shrugged, smiling sweetly at him. He wasn't using it, she said, an innocent grin on her face. Here, take it. It'll help, she said. Izuku gave her a "we'll talk about this later" look, before glancing down at the quill. It sparked in her hand, making her eyes widen. He wasn't even near it yet, and it was already reacting to his presence. Izuku took a breath before he grabbed the quill. Izuku's body surged with energy. Izuku grit his teeth as his body buzzed with power, his arm immediately healing at an accelerated rate. Amy backed up a little bit as Izuku shivered. After a second, the buzzing stopped, and Izuku looked down, his mask covering his eyes. Amy was silent for a second before she stepped forward slightly. Izuku, are you all right? She asked, and Izuku looked up, lifting his now light red arm up. He moved it around, noting that it was only sore. He grinned down at Amy, who grinned back. However, her grin disappeared when she noticed that he still had the 4 deep gashes in his cheek. She slowly touched his face, confused. Izuku blushed as Amy put her hand on his face, and he cleared his throat, snapping Amy out of her trance. You Amy? He asked. Amy stared at him for a second, before she blushed, hopping backwards. Sorry, I was just surprised that your cheek didn't heal, she stammered. Izuku mumbled a weak "it's fine," before he felt his cheek. He flinched at the sharp pain he felt, noting that yes, it was still an open wound. It has definitely healed a little bit from the quills, but his arm received the brunt of the energy, and he was glad it did. You want me to get another quill? She asked, and Izuku immediately shook his head with a smile. No, this is good. Thank you, Amy. You really helped me out here, Izuku said, holding his fist out. Amy tilted her head at it, confused. Oh, it's called a fist bump. You just make a fist and push it into mine. It's a sign of friendship and trust where I come from, he explained. Amy looked down at her fist before pushing it into Izuku's. Izuku smiled, placing his arm next to his side and examining his newly healed one. Amy looked back at her fist, unclenching it, before she smiled. Friendship and trust, huh? She thought to herself, a smile on her face. Izuku then lowered his sleeve, and Amy helped him place his glove back onto his arm. They walked inside the house, faced with a ticked-off Sonic. So, does anyone want to explain why you plucked out my favorite quill? Sonic asked. Amy raised a finger before exiting the house the way she came from. Sonic sighed, shaking his head. If it makes you feel better, your quill healed me, Izuku said, showing off his newly healed arm. Sonic's eyes widened as he viewed Izuku's arm. Wait, what? He asked, confused. Izuku hurriedly explained how he learned about the energy-filled quills. Wait, so you can absorb energy through loose hedgehog quills? Sonic asked, prompting a shrug from Izuku. I think so. I'm not really too sure how it works, but it's certainly useful, Izuku said, offering the quill back, and Sonic scoffed. What, am I gonna stick it back into my head? Just keep it, Sonic said, waving Izuku off. Izuku looked at the quill, before he shrugged and stuffed it into his utility belt, before following Amy, who was looking up at the sky with surprise and worry on her face. He paused, the smell of smoke assaulting his nose. He looked over to Amy to see her just standing there before she turned, her eyes wide. Izuku, that's the direction of my village, she said, and Izuku's eyes widened. He quickly activated OFA and scooped Amy up, holding her close to his body. Hold on tight, Amy, Izuku said, before he sped forward, the area around them blurring. Amy buried her face into his chest as he ran, reaching the source of the smoke in seconds. Izuku skidded to a stop as the sound of Robotnik's gleeful cackling faded away. Amy hopped out of his arms, dashing forwards into her village. Izuku soon followed, only to see Amy on her knees, looking at what used to be her village. Large piles of charcoal, ash, and soot sat everywhere, and Amy was staring down at a pair of beautiful golden rings. Tears stung at her wide-open eyes as she looked down at the beautiful jewelry, her shaking hands grasping one of the rings. These were my mother's, she whispered, just loud enough for Isuku to hear. Isuku full body flinched at the sentence, his eyes widening in horror. He looked around, seeing the charred bones of what used to be Amy's friends, her family, her home. Isuku watched as she curled her arms around herself and sobbed multiple painful times. He took a gentle step forward as Amy cried. The hedgehog girl bristled at being touched before the mallet from before appeared in her hands, and she swung it backwards, hitting Isuku and sending him flying backwards. Isuku landed on his back, groaning in surprise and pain. He barely avoided the second swing of Amy's hammer, scooching back as she swung at him, annihilating the ground beneath him and sending ash flying everywhere. Isuku hurriedly got to his feet, barely jumping away from a devastating swing from Amy that waved the dust away. Amy, he started, only for her to scream. Why? She screamed, swinging at him again. Isuku ducked under the swing, taking a few steps back as she rushed forward, swinging again. Why? She yelled again, swinging again and again and again. What have I ever done to anyone? Why does that fat fuck have it out for me? I don't understand. Amy screamed, tears flowing down her face as she rushed forward, swinging one more time, only for Isuku to catch the hammer. The ground cracked under him, and Isuku nearly lost his footing, but he luckily caught himself before ripping his mask off and looking Amy in the eyes. Amy, it's me, he yelled. Amy looked at him, her hate-filled scowl shaking, before more tears fell from her eyes. Why? Why would he? How could he do something like this? Amy asked, voice hollow. Izuku looked down at her, sympathy apparent. I don't know, Amy. I'm so sorry, he said, pulling her in for a deep hug. She sobbed into his shoulder. Amy dropped her hammer as it turned into sparkles once more, but neither cared as Amy sobbed, Izuku silently comforting her. Sonic shook his head as Tails asked if they should look for Amy and Izuku again. Tails, I told you they're fine, Sonic said, his patience running thin. But Tails started again, only for the door to gently open. Sonic and Tails looked at the door as Izuku walked in, mask down, carrying a completely hollow-looking Amy. Izuku gently set the girl down, and she silently thanked him, walking past Sonic and Tails without a word. Sonic watched her go, an eyebrow raised. He turned back to Izuku, who looked drained. Well, you look nothing like how I expected you to, Sonic commented, and Izuku scowled. Really? He asked, and Tails stepped in front of Sonic, looking at Izuku with concern. What happened to Ms. Amy? He asked. Izuku looked down at Tails, biting his lip. He took a second to formulate his response, answering in the most innocent way he could. Robotnik did something really mean to Amy. Just ... give her some space for a bit, alright, Izuku said, smiling down at Tails, who frowned. Why does Eggman have to be so mean all the time? He asked, walking away, eyes downcast. Sonic and Izuku both watched Tails walk away, and once the little fox was out of hearing range, Sonic turned to Izuku. Before he could even ask what had happened, Izuku turned to face Sonic, a glare on his face. Sonic flinched back from the look on Izuku's face. His mouth was set in a deep frown, and his eyes were glowing with a dark green sheen that sent shivers down Sonic's spine. Robotnik burned down Amy's village, killing everyone in it, Izuku stated quietly, but firmly. Sonic froze, his eyes wide. Izuku continued staring Sonic in the eyes, and the hedgehog slowly bristled his quills on instinct, staring back at Izuku with a nervous frown. Suddenly, Amy walked back into the room, and Izuku immediately stopped his glaring, looking at Amy in worry. The world started moving normally again for Sonic, and he looked around, seeing Tails looking at Amy in worry as she sat down without making a sound, her eyes lacking the lovely glow they usually had. Sonic put a hand to his heart, feeling it beating at a rapid pace, even for him. He slowly calmed down as he looked down at his hand. What ... was that? He thought. Was I imagining things? He thought, the sight of Izuku staring him down with a look that could kill ingrained into his mind. He looked back up to see Izuku attempting to comfort Amy in silence, but she was barely even responding to him, simply staring at nothing. She looked mildly interested in what Izuku was saying, but she didn't really show any other signs that she was listening other than nodding weakly. Suddenly, Tails butt into their conversation. Mr. Izuku, you know how I said I would get something for you and Ms. Amy situated? Well, I called a construction company, and they immediately agreed to build you guys a house free of charge when they learned you were with me. Being a hero has its perks, I guess. Tails started, and Izuku nodded along. Anyways ... the house is kind of finished already. Apparently it's supposed to be just like ours, only a little smaller, Tails explained, and Izuku's eyes widened in surprise. Really? It's already finished? He asked, prompting Tails to nod. Izuku smiled, turning to Amy and telling her that the house was finished, and his smile faded when she weakly responded that she'd heard. Tails frowned as well, looking worried for the girl. Sonic, however, was fairly indifferent. Yes, he did feel bad for her, and he hoped that she would come out of the situation a better person, but he felt that it wasn't his place to step in. This was a very private matter that he had absolutely no part of. Izuku smiled again, asking if Amy wanted to check it out now or later, and she responded that it didn't matter to her. Izuku frowned sadly, not because he was offended or anything. He just hated seeing Amy like this. She continued staring at nothing, and Izuku decided to give her some space. He stood up, his stomach growling. "I think I'm gonna go get something to eat," Izuku said, and Amy surprisingly stood up with him. Izuku looked at her. "You wanna come with, Amy?" he asked. She shrugged, walking outside. Izuku stared at her as she left, concern on his face. "We'll be back soon, guys," Izuku said to Sonic and Tails before he exited the house. He saw Amy waiting out front, her arms at her sides, and her eyes dull. Izuku exhaled, walking over to her. "Is there anywhere you want to eat?" Izuku asked. Amy shrugged, walking forward. Izuku sighed quietly as he walked with her. He didn't know where they were going, but he didn't question her. Maybe she needed a walk. Izuku walked next to Amy for around 15 minutes, attempting to start a conversation a few times, but giving up quickly. He wasn't mad at Amy or anything like that. He didn't think he could be mad at Amy when she was going through something like this, but he was getting increasingly worried by her despondent responses. Izuku was about to say something, only for danger sense to warn him of something behind him. He immediately activated OFA and grabbed Amy, making her squeak. He looked behind him, seeing a couple large Mobians walking towards him. One of them was a bear, and the other two were gorillas. They all grinned at him and Amy, wearing all black. The bear had a bandana on his head, and he stared at Amy with a grin. "You gonna eat that?" he asked, and Izuku narrowed his eyes, gripping Amy tighter. "Haha, I'm just kidding. You should have seen the look on your face," the bear said, his two friends laughing along with him. Izuku stared at them without moving a single muscle, and Amy scowled at them, showing the first emotion since she came back from her burned village. But seriously though, give me the girl," the bear said, a cocky smile back on his face. Izuku simply calmly slipped his mask on. But before he could do anything, Amy struggled out of his arms, mallet in her hands. "You want me, creeps? Come and get me," she yelled, dashing forwards. The group of Mobians all flinched, and she rushed forward, slamming her hammer into the bear's stomach and sending him flying a foot back. The two gorillas watched with wide eyes before they got to their knees, hands in a pleading position. "We're sorry," they yelled in unison, and Amy glared at them, a concerning rage in her eyes. "Get the hell away from me," she said, grip on her mallet tightening. They quickly skittered away, grabbing their friend on the way out. Izuku walked up to Amy, but before he could say anything, her mallet disappeared, and she turned to face him, her anger all but gone. "Amy, are you all right?" he started, and she subtly clenched her fists. "Am I all right?" she asked, staring up at him in disbelief. "Did you seriously just ask that?" she asked, and Izuku winced, nodding. "Sorry, that was a dumb question. Do you still want to get something to eat?" Izuku asked, and her eyes softened. She looked down in shame, angry at herself for talking to Izuku like that. "Yes," she muttered quietly, and Izuku nodded, continuing down the path. Amy looked down at her hands, clenching them. Her hammer. It was strong. Really strong. Maybe she could use it. Her eyes shone with rage as she thought of the man that took her family away from her, an idea forming itself in her head. She quickly caught up with Izuku after he noticed that she wasn't following. She ignored his concerned stare. Amy looked at Izuku as he ate. He garnered a few stares, but he mostly ignored them. They had stopped at a small cafe, and she had ordered a simple fruit bowl. Izuku though he had a large plate with many different food groups. Amy stared at it as she placed a grape in her mouth. Izuku chuckled at her expression. I need a lot of food to keep myself fit. I have a pretty fast metabolism, and I can't have these going away," Izuku said, flexing his arms. Amy blushed slightly before shaking her head slightly. Izuku ate a strip of beef, grinning. Amy smiled softly back before she saw someone approaching from behind. It was a scowling wolf Mobian, and he appeared to be walking towards Izuku. Amy's smile faded as she looked at the wolf, and Izuku looked at her, confused, before he turned around to face the wolf Mobian. "We don't want your kind around here, human," the wolf said, his tail flicking up and knocking his plate off the table. It fell to the ground and shattered, causing everyone to turn to them. Couples stopped talking, people stopped eating, just to stare at the scene. Isuku looked down at his shattered plate before looking up, unimpressed. Hell of a way to show it. You do realize that someone has to clean that up, right? Izuku asked, before getting out of his chair, picking up the shards of ceramic, with OFA active in his hands so as to not get hurt by the sharp shards. He stood up, and the wolf scowled at him as he disposed of the ceramic shards, before he sat back down in his chair. I hope you're going to pay for our food, because you just wasted what my friend here was going to pay for, Izuku said. The wolf Mobian slammed his clawed hand on the table, startling Amy and causing Izuku to give him an annoyed look. Do you want something? He asked. The wolf Mobian growled at him, getting up in his face. I want you to get your dirty human ass out of here. You don't belong here, he said, and Izuku's eye twitched. He looked around, smiling comfortingly to everyone. Sorry about this, folks. I'll make sure to pay for the mess. Amy, you said the currency here is rings, right? He asked, and she nodded quickly. Izuku nodded back with a smile, before he turned back to the wolf, grabbing him by his black waistcoat, and simply disappearing. Amy blinked in surprise, before she shrunk down and into her seat, embarrassed. Everyone else was confused and more than a little surprised, and they all simultaneously looked to Amy, wanting answers. The girl shrunk at the rapid questions hurled at her. What the hell, Izuku? Did you really just leave me here to fight some guy? She thought to herself, angry. Izuku threw the wolf Mobian to the ground, glaring down at him. He crossed his arms and floated a foot off the ground. He didn't even bother slipping his mask over his head. The wolf growled as he got up, glaring back with hatred. He then rushed forwards, swinging with a powerful right hook, leading into a swift left jab, along with another right hook. Izuku simply avoided all of them, using float to execute fast maneuvers. The wolf growled again, before he rushed forwards once more, throwing a flurry of quick jabs that Izuku had a bit more trouble dodging, only being managed to be hit by one of the dozen punches. But he shook it off rather quickly. Izuku had to admit that he was impressed. This Mobian clearly knew how to fight. The wolf Mobian grinned, wolfishly at hitting Izuku, even if it was only once. Izuku hated saying it, but he respected the Mobian's skill. Not so tough now, are ya? He said, his grin still on his face. Electricity danced across Izuku's skin as he smiled. All right then, he said, landing on the ground. He waited for a second, before the wolf Mobian rushed forwards, attempting a dashing knee before kicking off the cafe wall, leading to a dropkick. Izuku stopped the move before it could even start, sidestepping and elbowing the wolf's back, stunning him. Izuku then grabbed his opponent's head and slammed it down to a knee in the upper back. The wolf man yelped as Izuku kneed him in the spine, falling to the ground. Izuku took a step back, letting the wolf get up. What's your name? Izuku asked. The wolf got up, grimacing. It's Bio-Wolf, but everyone around here just calls me Wolf. What's it to you? Wolf asked, glaring at Izuku. Izuku Midoriya. You fight well. Have you ever thought of fighting the Eggman? Izuku asked as he took a step forward. Wolf growled at Izuku, his stance getting a lot more savage. You work with Dr. Eggman? Wolf asked. Izuku shook his head, unclipping his glove and lowering his sleeve to show off the brand new spiral scar. No, he did this to me, he said, showing Wolf his arm. He growled, looking down. I hate that man. If I could kill him right now, I'd do it without a second thought, Wolf said, getting back into his feet. Izuku blinked, looking at him, a little stunned. It was a little dark. Right? Anyways, I was wondering if you ever considered fighting against Eggman. Like what Sonic does? Izuku asked, and Wolf's eyes widened. Of course I've considered it. Everyone's considered it. He snapped back, and Izuku flinched. Geez, alright, he said. I'm new here, calm down. Izuku said, his patience wearing thin. Wolf glared at him, but he did calm down a bit. Thank you. Now, why if you can fight this well, have you not been helping? Izuku asked, and Wolf growled. That's none of your business, human. Wolf said, pulling his waistcoat back up. Fine, I can understand wanting to keep a secret. Sorry for asking, Izuku said, standing up. Good, now leave me alone, he said, and Izuku sighed, before something was tossed at his chest. He fumbled around for a second, before catching what was thrown at him. He looked down to see a bundle of rings. 40 for the food ... and the plate. Wolf said, walking away. Izuku smiled. Thank you, he replied. Izuku smiled down at the rings, walking back into the cafe, seeing the customers were bombarding Amy with questions, and she was obviously terrified. The customers then all saw Izuku, and grew silent. Amy, sorry, here are your rings, Izuku said, placing the rings on the table. That should be enough for the food and the plates, he said to a woman who worked there, before he walked Amy out of the restaurant. Amy, what happened in there? he asked, and she glared at him. Why, you just left me there while my friend just supposedly mugged someone behind their building, Amy said, and Isuku paused. Oh, he said, cringing. Oh my god, I'm so sorry, he said. Amy shook her head, not having it. I just want to go home. Please, let's go home. I don't, she trailed, looking down, holding her arms and tearing up. Isuku cringed at the sight. Of course, he said, picking Amy up and jumping in the air. He flew a little slower than usual, letting Amy take in the view. She did calm down a little as she looked at the beautiful green valley from above. That was until she spotted the remnants of her burned-down village. She flinched in Izuku's arms, and he looked down to see the village. He winced, about to apologize, when Amy spoke. Wait, drop me down here, she said, looking down at something. Izuku flowed down, lowering them down to the ground. Once Amy's feet touched the ground, she pushed away from Izuku, running over to a golden glint in the dirt. Izuku watched her go, following slowly. He watched as she dug the golden rings from before out of the ash. She picked the soot-covered rings up and turned around to let Izuku see them. I almost left these behind, she whispered softly. She blew on the rings, ash floating to the ground softly. The rings shone a brilliant golden color in the moonlight, and she slowly unlocked the rings, clasping them together over her own wrists. The next time Eggman attacks, I'm going to fight back, Amy said, looking at Izuku, whose eyes widened. Wait, what? He asked. Amy looked up at him. I'm going to fight back, she repeated, and Izuku winced, looking away for a second. That's really honorable of you, but I don't know if I want you fighting, Izuku said, looking Amy in the eyes. She narrowed hers, clenching her fists. I can handle myself. I'm the one that took out Metal Sonic, remember? She shouted. Izuku sputtered. Gee, that's different, he said back. Amy frowned. How? She asked, and Izuku shook his head. Because it just is, he shouted, and Amy teared up, looking at him. Why aren't you letting me do this? She asked, and Izuku couldn't even get a word out before she raised her arms, gesturing to the area around her. So, what? I'm just supposed to sit here and watch as everyone else takes down the man that burned down my village and killed my family. Is that what you're telling me right now? Amy yelled, and Izuku felt tears stinging at his eyes. Amy, that's not fair, he started, only for Amy to laugh sarcastically. Amy shouted, sobbing. Not fair. My friends, my family. Amy inhaled, closing her eyes and opening them, glaring at Izuku with determination. Don't you dare talk to me about fairness. I'm going to fight whether you like it or not. Amy spat, walking past him and outside the village. Izuku grabbed her arm, stopping her. No, you aren't. He's too dangerous, Izuku said, shaking his head, and Amy turned, ripping her arm away. You don't get to decide what I do. We're friends. That doesn't mean you dictate my life, she yelled, glaring at Izuku, who frowned, his eyes drying as his patience wore thin. I'm not trying to dictate anything. I'm trying to stop you from getting yourself killed, Izuku yelled, and Amy scowled at him. You think I care about that now? I have nothing. Nobody. All I have left is these stupid rings, Amy shouted, and Izuku took a step forward, trying to comfort her, but she simply slapped his hand away. Get away from me, she yelled, a glare on her face. Izuku took a step back, looking at her in shock. It was silent for a few seconds, before his gaze hardened. You shouldn't talk like that, Izuku said sternly, and Amy rolled her eyes in an exaggerated fashion. Should talk like that. That's what you sound like, Amy said, childishly, and Izuku's eye twitched in irritation. Stop being so childish and let me, he started, and Amy's glare intensified tenfold. Childish? I'll show you childish, dickhead, she shouted, before flipping him off. Izuku stared at the rude gesture for a second, before he finally snapped. Power coursed through his body as he stepped forward, and Amy's eyes widened as she took a step back. Fine then, he said, making Amy flinch. She looked him in the eyes, gulping at the angry shine that emanated from them. She blinked, and Izuku was suddenly standing right in front of her, making her yelp and fall backwards. He grabbed her by her arm and lifted her in the air, making sure not to grip her too tightly. She winced, whacking his hand. Izuku, let me go. This isn't funny, she yelled, and Izuku took a breath, closing his eyes. He opened his eyes, looking at her with a calculated stare. You want to fight? Then you'll fight, he said, before dropping her. She landed on her ass before she stumbled to her feet as Izuku stared down at her. Summon your hammer, he demanded, and she looked up at him with wide eyes. What? She asked, confused. Izuku raised his arm before slamming it down towards her. Her eyes widened, and she summoned her hammer on instinct, blocking the blow with the handle. Izuku, what are you doing? She asked, panicked. Izuku grabbed the handle of the hammer, lifting it, and her along with it, staring her in the eyes. I'm your enemy. We're fighting. I won't go easy on you. If you do a satisfactory job, then maybe I will consider training you. If not, you don't fight. No arguing, Izuku said, dropping the hammer. Amy landed on her feet this time, and she looked at him, shocked. Is he testing me? She thought, her eyes wide. Izuku took a few steps back, arms at his side. He slipped his mask on, electricity flowing around him with a soft thrum. Come, he said, putting his hands up. What, this isn't a fair fight at all. You're way stronger than me, she yelled, and Izuku responded by dashing towards her. She yelped, holding her hammer up as a sort of shield, only for Izuku to knee her in the stomach. Amy's eyes widened as she shouted in pain, falling to the ground. Izuku stared down at her, cringing slightly under his mask, before he shook his head. He needed to do this for her. She might not understand now, but she will eventually. Amy slowly got to her feet, before she flinched, and threw up at Izuku's feet. Izuku simply walked away from the bile as Amy stared at it, shocked. Izuku took a small breath. This was the deciding factor. How would she react to being hit? Yes, she might hate him, and he couldn't blame her for that. However, if she chose the other option. Izuku shook his head slightly. He was getting ahead of himself. He watched Amy closely, clenching his fists as she got to her feet. She was still looking down at the ground, and she wiped her mouth with her glove, seeing excess bile and some blood. You hit me, she said, and Izuku flinched, before hardening his gaze. Yes, I did. The question is, what are you gonna do about it? He asked, and Amy's eye twitched, before she scowled at him. What am I gonna do about it? I'm gonna kick your ass, that's what. Amy yelled, rushing forward. Izuku grinned under his mask, blocking a swipe from her hammer. Good answer, he replied, before he slammed his fist into her chin. She stumbled backwards, before she raised her hammer, slamming it down towards him. Izuku jumped back, avoiding the attack as she looked at him, a bit of blood leaking from her lips. No words were said as Izuku flew forwards, kicking her in the cheek. She was launched backwards a little bit from the blow, but she simply bounced back with even more tenacity. Izuku had a wide grin under his mask as he sidestepped a downward slam, only for her to twirl the hammer in her hands and swipe horizontally at him. Izuku hopped onto the head of the hammer, black whip shooting out of his back and slamming into her shoulders, pushing her into a headbutt that hit her in the face. She stumbled backwards, her hammer dissipating into sparkles. Izuku's eyes immediately widened, and he stepped forward, reaching out, only for her eyes to open, a rage-filled glare startling him. She resummoned her hammer, holding it backwards. She then thrust the hilt of the weapon into his stomach, and Izuku grunted in pain, before she tossed the hammer in the air, grabbing it correctly this time and slamming it down on Izuku's head. Izuku yelped, holding the top of his head as he took a few steps back. He opened one eye, seeing Amy looking at him with wide eyes. I hit you, she muttered, blood leaking out of her nose. A wide smile then grew on her face. I hit you. I actually hit you. Take that, carrot top, she said, pumping her fist, and Izuku couldn't help but smile with her, despite the pain in his head. I have to admit, I'm impressed. However, we aren't finished yet, Izuku said, and Amy's smile disappeared. Wait, we aren't, she asked, and Izuku shook his head, powering up from 5% to 8%. We're going to keep sparring until one of us can't fight anymore. You want to fight, so we'll fight. You're doing great so far, so I expect the best out of you, Amy, he said, and Amy's eyes finally widened in realization. Oh, this is the training, she yelled, and Izuku rolled his eyes in amusement. Yes, Amy, this is the training, he confirmed. Amy pumped her fist again. Yes, let's keep going, she said, readjusting her grip on her mallet. It was nearly 2 hours later when Amy finally fell to her knees, covered in bruises, scrapes, and scratches. Her green shirt was ripped in multiple places, her left eye was slightly swollen, and she had a busted lip. Her quills were messy and unkempt, and a few were even in the ground. But despite all this, she had a smile on her face. I'm done, she muttered, and Izuku relaxed his body. His own clothes was dirtied, and he had his fair share of sore spots. Izuku smiled as he walked up to her, holding his hand out for her to grab. She looked at it, before she leapt forward, enveloping him in a hug. Izuku was surprised, and he fell to his ass as Amy nuzzled her face into his chest. Amy, he asked, and it was then that he realized that she was crying. Thank you, Izuku. I am sorry for being so rude to you earlier. She started, and Izuku shook his head, wrapping his own arms around her. You don't need to explain yourself to me, Amy. I know what it's like to lose someone. I would be a hypocrite if I judged you for anything that you've done today. Izuku said, and Izuku smiled softly as Amy cried just a little bit harder. Izuku landed outside Sonic and Tails' house, carrying Amy. He walked up to the door, but it opened before they could even walk up. Sonic stepped outside, glaring at the two. Tails has been worried sick, he started, only for his eyes to widen at the state of the two. "Whoa, what the hell happened to you two?" he asked, and Izuku chuckled. "We talked," he said, and Amy nodded along with him, a small smile on her face. Sonic noticed Amy's heightened mood and simmered down a little bit. Tails then opened the door and squeezed past Sonic, his eyes wide. "Oh, you guys are all right," he said, relieved. Izuku cringed, feeling guilty. "Sorry we took so long. Amy and I had some business to tend to," Izuku said, and Tails' face immediately scrounged up in disgust. Were you guys kissing?" he asked, and both Izuku and Amy blushed heavily as Sonic laughed. What? No, why would you even assume that?" Izuku asked, and Tails looked at Sonic. "Sonic told me that when a boy and a girl have business together, they kiss," he explained, and both Izuku and Amy looked at Sonic, deadpan. "Hey, you try and explain the birds and the bees to him," he said, and Tails tilted his head innocently. "Birds and bees, what about them?" he asked, blinking innocently. Izuku grinned lopsidedly as Amy put her hands to her face, her eyes practically sparkling. "I see the problem," Izuku said, and Sonic huffed. "Exactly. Seriously though, what happened to you guys?" Sonic asked. Izuku shrugged, looking at Amy as she conversed excitedly with Tails. "We sparred. She wants to join the fight against Eggman," Izuku said, and Sonic's eyes widened. "What? She can't fight," he whispered, and Izuku slipped his mask down, showing Sonic a large purple bruise on his cheek. Sonic raised an eyebrow at that. "So, she bruised you. That's not that impressive," Sonic said. "I can punch mountains away," Izuku said, deadpan. "Sure you can," Sonic replied, walking towards Tails. "Alright, buddy, it's just about your bedtime," Sonic said, and Tails' eyes widened before he pouted. "What? But I don't want to go to bed," he said, crossing his arms. Sonic rubbed the underside of his nose, grinning at Tails. "Well, that's just too bad, isn't it?" he said, before waving at Izuku and Amy as he walked Tails inside. Amy sighed, grinning. "Tails is just the most adorable little kid," she said, and Izuku chuckled, shaking his head. "You just might be right," he confirmed, before they walked down towards their new house. They had flown over it while coming over here, and it was only around a block away from Sonic's house, so they decided to walk there. Within a few minutes, they arrived at the house, and Izuku whistled, nodding to himself. It was definitely a bit smaller than Sonic's house, but that was honestly fine with him. As long as they had the proper equipment to live, he was fine. Amy just looked excited to see the house in general. Izuku walked up to the wooden door and grabbed the handle, pulling it. It was obviously locked, and he pulled a little harder, smiling when it didn't budge. "Alright, the door is sturdy. That's a good sign," Izuku said, before noticing a key on the front porch. He bent down, grabbing it and placing it in the keyhole, unlocking the door and opening it. He held the door open for Amy, who walked inside with a pep in her step. "Whoa, hey, there's a note on the table," she said, walking over and grabbing the note. "Hey guys, this is from Tails. I left you two each a housewarming gift in the closet in you guys' rooms. I hope you don't mind," she read aloud. Izuku hummed, walking to the room closest to him. He entered, seeing a queen-size bed, a wooden nightstand, a large dresser, a hamper, and a closet. He walked over to the closet and opened it to find a small red shirt along with a white skirt and a pair of blue panties. He closed the closet door with a blush, exiting the room to see Amy doing the same thing, a similar blush on her face. "I, found your gift," Izuku said, and she nodded, looking down. "Funny, I was just about to say the same thing," she said, and they both entered the other room. Izuku opened the clothes to find a blue t-shirt, red sweatpants, and some white boxers. He hummed in appreciation, grabbing the clothes and setting them on his bed. He looked at them, before stretching, wincing at the tightness of his shoulders. He walked out of his room and into Amy's. "Hey, I'm gonna go take a shower," he started, before freezing. She was in the middle of taking her torn shirt off when Izuku walked in. Their faces each burnt crimson as Izuku covered his eyes. He luckily only saw her stomach, but it was still more than he should have seen. Sorry," he yelped. He heard a minuscule "it's okay" as he turned and left, before he entered the bathroom, grabbing a towel from the rack against the wall. "That's convenient," he muttered, still embarrassed. He shook his head, closing the bathroom door and turning the water on. Amy was still blushing when she walked out of her room, sitting at the table. She had decided against changing, not wanting to dirty her new clothes. She was all gross, and it just wouldn't make sense to change without taking a shower. She looked down at her ripped shirt with a sigh. She hadn't particularly cared about this shirt, but she still liked it. All her other clothes were in her village when it ... Yeah. Amy's gaze hardened as she thought about what remained of her village, dark thoughts of Eggman filling her head. He would attack eventually, and she would be ready to pay him back tenfold. She looked down as she summoned her hammer, looking at it with an inquisitive glance. "You'll pay for what you did to me, Eggman. You're going to regret even thinking about burning my home down when I'm done," she said, grinning darkly. Her hammer dissipated as she heard the water turn off. She placed her hands on her lap and sighed as she heard the bathroom door open. She looked up, only to squeak and look back down. She didn't know why she expected him to be in anything but a towel. Sorry," she said, and she heard an embarrassed chuckle. "I suppose it happens to everyone," he joked before he entered his room. After a few minutes, he walked out of his room, dressed in his new clothes, while rubbing his hair with the towel. Amy nodded at his clothes, smiling at him. "How's it feel to get out of the costume for once?" she asked, and he smiled at her. "Pretty good. It's needed a wash for a bit," Isuku said as he carried the costume to the laundry room, placing it in the washer and starting it. Amy playfully plugged her nose. "I mean, I didn't want to say anything, but," she said, and Isuku rolled his eyes as she devolved into a series of giggles. "I'm gonna go lay down. You should take a shower before you go to sleep as well. There's still plenty of hot water," Isuku said, entering his room. He placed the towel in the hamper next to his dresser and laid down, sliding the covers over him. He sighed as he relaxed, quickly falling asleep. Dr. Robotnik growled to himself as he worked late into the night. He wiped a little bit of sweat off of his face. He scowled at the broken monitors as he turned to face them. "Those hideous hedgehogs and that traitorous little boy will pay for what they've done." The doctor's scowl then turned into a menacing grin. "Luckily for me, that blue hedge rat forgot about one itty-bitty little thing," the doctor said, before pulling out an incredibly cleanly cut green emerald, holding it in the palm of his hand. It positively glowed with power, and Robotnik laughed, a small robotic skeleton behind him. He didn't notice it clench its fist as he laughed into the night. Isuku awoke with a light groan. He looked up, seeing the light that flowed into the window. He sighed softly, relaxing in his bed a bit, slowly waking up. He blinked when he felt something brush up against his side. He blinked before he looked down to see a small lump under his blanket, and he gulped before slowly grabbing the blanket and lifting it up, peering under with a cautious gaze. "Oh, it's just Amy," he thought, blushing. Why the hell was Amy nestled into his side? She was breathing softly, a tiny smile on her face. Isuku calmed down. He couldn't move her. She looked absolutely adorable like that. Isuku huffed silently, looking at Amy as she snored. He then dropped the blanket and picked up his picture, gently placing it back into his pocket. He placed his arms over his chest, thinking to himself, "Well, this is my life now," he thought. Luckily, he only had to wait around 18 minutes before Amy started stirring. He looked down as the lump in the blanket moved, finding its way to the edge of the blanket, and he smiled as Amy poked her head out of the blanket, wearing her own new clothes. "Any reason you decided to vacate to my bed?" he asked, and the tired Amy simply yawned. "My bed ... comfy." Amy simply murmured, rubbing at her eyes. Isuku hummed before getting out of the bed. "I'll take a look at it later. I'm gonna go take a shower," Isuku said, walking out of the room. Amy watched him go, before yawning again, getting back into a comfortable position, becoming a bundle of quills once more. Isuku quickly switched his costume from the washer to the dryer, before walking to the bathroom and closing the door. Amy, not being able to fall back asleep, walked out of Izuku's room. She walked over to the fridge, opening it to see nothing inside. She grumbled, taking out her ring purse. She had enough to do some shopping, and it's not like she couldn't just pick up a few extra rings along the way. She hummed, looking around, seeing a pen and a small notepad. She ripped a blank page out, before writing that she had gone out to get groceries. She then hummed, leaving the house with her ring purse over her shoulder. A few minutes later, Isuku walked out of the bathroom, body dried and towel over his waist. He looked around for Amy, seeing the note. He quickly read it, chuckling at the little face she drew at the bed on the note. Before his smile disappeared, his eyes widening. "Wait, she left alone?" he asked, before zipping to the dryer. He waited, annoyed at how long the dryer took. After around 10 minutes, he decided he didn't care anymore and got dressed in his mostly dry costume. He then zipped out of the house, quickly taking to the sky. Amy hummed as she entered Central City. It was honestly pretty rare to see Mobians around here, as a pretty large amount of them didn't care for humans, mostly due to Eggman. However, not all humans were bad. A good chunk of them were kind and inviting, like Isuku. However, some of them, "Hey, Amy," a voice said, and Amy cringed. She knew that voice. "Hey, Tenjin," she said, turning to face the human boy. He was a little older than her, at 18, but for whatever reason, he was utterly obsessed with her. Whenever he saw her, he made sure to confess how much he loved her. She tried to tune him out as he rambled about how they were going to get married and have children, and she winced. "Is this how I look to Sonic?" she asked, embarrassed. "Why are you talking about that blue guy when I'm right here?" Tenjin said, pointing to himself. Amy's eye twitched, a vein visibly throbbing on her forehead. She then turned left into the market, sighing in relief. She quickly grabbed a basket at the front, walking deeper into the store. "Oh, there you are," a voice said, and she turned to see Henjin following her into the store. Her eyelid twitched, before she took a deep breath, smiling at Henjin, irritated. "I am trying to go shopping. Could you please leave me alone?" Amy asked, trying to be kind. Henjin flinched, looking down. "Oh," he said, and Amy grit her teeth. "Here it comes," she thought. Henjin then rubbed his arm, looking away. "Sorry for bothering you. I'll go now. I am currently walking away." "Quite sad," Henjin said, finally leaving her alone. She sighed, turning around, only to see a few people giving her dirty looks. She quickly adopted a deadpan stare, walking back into the store. This was probably the worst part about dealing with Henjin. He always made a scene when she rejected his advances, and it was beyond annoying. Everyone who saw the interaction immediately saw her as some rude girl who harshly rejected a boy, when he practically stalked her, and starting to really feel bad for Sonic. She muttered, ignoring the judging eyes as she grabbed what she needed. Isuku flew over the area, scanning the area with his eyes. "Where is she?" he asked himself. He had been looking for the past 15 minutes, and he still hadn't found her. However, his attention was directed somewhere else when he noticed a group of shady individuals dragging a lone snake Mobian into an alleyway. Izuku's eyes narrowed as he watched. He looked back down, scanning one final time for Amy before he turned directions, diving down, and landing softly on an opposing rooftop. He looked down as one of the human men slammed the snake against the wall. "Hey, there you are, Pent," the man said, smiling threateningly at the snake, who looked absolutely terrified. Please just leave me alone. I don't want any trouble," the snake man pleaded. The man that was holding the Mobian against the wall looked behind him and to his cohorts, grinning. "Well, should I let him go, guys?" he asked with a laugh. The two men and one woman laughed along with him. "Well, what do you think?" the man said, turning back to the Mobian. Before the snake man could even say anything, the human scowled, pulling out a pair of pliers. "I suggest you don't speak. It'll make pulling all those sharp teeth out even harder for you. We don't wild animals in our city," the man said, and Izuku had seen enough. He slipped his mask and rebreather on as he shot Black Whip out, wrapping it around the human's waist and pulling him backwards. The man dropped the pliers with a yell as he slammed into the wall. Izuku then jumped down where the human once stood. He turned back to the snake man. "Get out of here," he said, and the snake smiled. Thank you so much," he yelled, slithering away. Izuku faced the criminals as they turned to him, glares on all their faces. "What the hell? You're really fine with letting those beasts run around," the woman yelled, and Izuku flew forward, burying his knee into her stomach, following it up with a palm strike to the face, breaking the woman's nose. "They're not beasts, you racist," he retaliated, danger sense warning him of a strike coming from behind him. He crouched, digging the metal claws at the tips of his fingertips into the ground, and scraping them across the pavement, sparks flying into the man's eyes. He screeched in pain, holding his hands to his eyes. Izuku then jumped off the wall, slamming his shoulder into the man, resulting in the man flying back, hitting the wall, and denting it slightly. He was definitely out for the count. Izuku then turned as the woman got up, only to get punched in the cheek by a man with a pair of brass knuckles. Izuku stumbled backwards, catching himself as well as the incoming punch from the man. He glared into the man's eyes, electricity surrounding him. The man's eyes widened. "Hello," he said. Amy walked out of the grocery store, raising an eyebrow at the crowd that had gathered around an alley. She shrugged, walking towards the group when they all made way for something. She heard a powerful F-whoosh sound and immediately made her way through the crowd, appreciating her small size for once. She pushed her way to the front to see a man missing a few teeth sliding across the ground. Amy then saw Izuku walk out the alleyway towards the man. Amy looked around at all the people before taking a deep breath. He took another look at the terrified man that Izuku was beating up for some reason and rushed out, still holding her grocery bags. "Stop. He's had enough," she yelled, and Izuku looked down at her in surprise, before he exhaled, powering down. However, that didn't last long though, as Izuku's eyes widened under his mask and the electricity came back with a vengeance. Amy turned around to see the barrel of a gun pointed directly at her head, her own eyes widening and her face paling. Boom! Everyone yelped as the gun fired, and Amy closed her eyes, only for nothing to happen. She opened her eyes to see Izuku standing in front of her. He turned to face her, black whip coming out of his shoulder and grabbing the man's gun, crushing it. She looked down at his stomach, seeing blood quickly soaking through his costume. "Let's go," Izuku said, grabbing Amy and taking off. Izuku wrapped Black Whip around the grocery bags so they wouldn't fall, and Amy looked at him, eyes wide. "Why, you're hurt," she said, and Izuku smiled. "I'm fine," he said, hiding the excruciating pain. She whimpered as she looked at his new wound. "I shouldn't have ran out there," she muttered. They quickly landed, and Izuku let go of Amy. "Take those groceries inside. I'll be in there in a minute," Izuku said, and Amy nodded, looking at him for a second before running inside. She quickly placed the groceries in the fridge and cabinets before she rushed back outside. She gasped as she saw Izuku lying in the grass. She quickly rushed over to him, rolling him over with a grunt of effort. She looked at him for a second before she grabbed him by the arms, attempting to lift him and failing miserably. "Come on, why are you so heavy?" she asked, before panting. I can do this," she muttered, grabbing his arms and attempting to lift him again. Unbeknownst to her, her wrist rings crackled with a soft pink electricity. Her eyes opened in surprise as the struggle was gone. She looked over Izuku's shoulder to see if anyone was helping her lift him. Nope, it was just her. Why was he so light now? Sure, it wasn't like lifting a feather, but he certainly wasn't light anymore. Amy shook her head, concentrating. She dragged him into the house, his feet dragging across the floor, scratching the nice wood. She winced at the marks, hoping that they would just come out with a nice wax. She slowly dragged Izuku to her room, placing him on her bed with a huff. She looked over him, noticing that the red stain was getting bigger. "Oh God, I have to hurry," she murmured. She looked around his suit, noticing the small zipper going up his chest. She grabbed it, quickly unzipping the top of his suit and sliding the top down his body, ignoring the blush on her face. "It shouldn't be surprising that he's so fit," she said, before she blanched, her face going pale again at the bloody wound. At least she could see the bullet. Amy took a deep breath before running out of the room and into the bathroom. She grabbed the first aid kit that she saw earlier, opening it and grabbing a roll of sterile bandages and tweezers. She ran back to her room, setting the bandages on her nightstand, before hopping back onto her bed. She looked at Izuku, grabbing his hand and squeezing it lightly. "If you can hear me then this is going to hurt," she said, before slowly inserting the tweezers into his wound. He squeezed her hand as he grit his teeth in his state of unconsciousness, and she took a deep breath, slowly digging deeper into his wound, grabbing the bullet and dragging it out. She sighed in relief when she got the bloody bullet out. She placed the tweezers and bullet on her nightstand next to her bandages, which she then grabbed. She then slid him off her bed, and he landed harshly on the ground. But at least she had access to his back now. She wrapped the bandages around his abdomen, blushing as her hands brushed up against his torso. After a minute, she clipped the bandage, before taking a few steps back. She looked down at her gloves, wincing at the blood on them. She really hoped they didn't stain. She shook her head with a frown, walking up and grabbing Izuku by the arms, and dragging him onto her bed, letting him rest there. She sighed, glad that she had actually done something to help Izuku for once. "But I'm the one who got him shot in the first place," she whispered, walking out the room. She looked back to see Izuku breathing softly as he rested, before she narrowed her eyes at the ground. I need to be better," she whispered. Izuku's eyes opened to the sound of muffled grunting. He sat up, wincing in pain. He looked down to see bandages wrapped around his torso. "Oh right, the bullet. Amy must have dragged me inside and patched me up," he muttered, standing up with a grunt. "This bed really is uncomfortable," Izuku commented, walking out to the living room. He could still hear those muffled grunts. Just what was that? He put his shoes on, walking outside to see Amy struggling to do push-ups. Izuku watched for a minute as her arms shook, a blank look on his face. "She's really serious about this, isn't she? I can't say that I blame her," Izuku thought, remembering how he felt when he found her body. Izuku blinked, shaking the thought away, and walking towards Amy, who looked at him. "Oh, you're up," she said, slowly getting to her feet. Izuku nodded, looking at her curiously. "You bandaged me, right?" he asked, and she nodded, looking away with a small blush. "Well, someone had to," she said, and Izuku smiled at her. "Thank you, Amy. Did you get the bullet out?" he asked, and she nodded, shuddering at the memory. "Yeah, it was scary," she said, and Izuku hummed. Well, you did a great job, he said, giving her a thumbs up along with a grin. She smiled back, nodding. Anyways, what exactly are you doing out here? He asked, and Amy looked away. Oh, just lying out in the sun, she said, and Isuku raised an eyebrow. Really, lying out in the sun? He asked, and she nodded. Yep, it's a nice day out. Nice and warm, she said, grinning nervously. Isuku hummed, nodding. Well, alright then. Have fun, he said, and she sighed in relief. Isuku walked back to the house, opening the door, before he paused and turned around. Oh, and Amy? He asked. She looked up at him, surprised. Why yes, she asked. You're supposed to keep your back straight while pushing yourself up, otherwise the workout won't be as effective, he said with a grin. Amy's eyes widened, before she frowned, looking down at the ground, an embarrassed blush on her face. Isuku looked at her, amused, before he shook his head, walking over to her and dropping to the ground himself. She looked at him in surprise as he started doing one-handed push-ups. She pouted, going back to her normal ones. TCH, show off, she muttered, and Isuku laughed. Isuku and Amy walked in the house, Isuku with an amused grin, and Amy with an exhausted frown. She dragged her feet as she walked, her body sagging. You're insane you know that, she accused, and Isuku shrugged. So I've been told, he responded, handing her one of the new plastic water bottles she had bought. She graciously took it, quickly chugging it with a satisfied sigh. Izuku drank his a bit slower, allowing himself to relax. So, how was your shopping trip? Izuku asked, and Amy groaned. Ugh, don't even remind me. So, there's this guy, right? A bit older than you, and a real tool. He will not leave me alone. He's been after me for like a year. He just keeps trying to get together with me. And every time I tell him to go away, he causes a scene and makes me look like the bad guy. He's the one who follows me everywhere, she said, placing her empty water bottle on the table. Izuku raised an eyebrow. Didn't you? He started, and Amy glared. Yes, but I don't think I really like him like that anymore, she said, her annoyed grimace disappearing to that of an insightful look. Izuku hummed, setting his own bottle down. Oh really? Why's that? He asked, and Amy hummed, looking at her hands. Watching you get hurt like that it made me realize something. Yeah, I admire Sonic and what he does, but I don't think I love him. I don't know if I ever did. He's cool and handsome, but he's just not as great as I thought he was, she said, and Izuku's eyes widened. He looked at her, a confused look on his face. What made you change your mind? He asked, and she looked at him for a second, before blushing and turning away. That's a secret, she answered, standing up. Izuku shrugged, nodding. That's fair. I can understand keeping a secret, he said, taking another sip of his water. Amy was about to go to her room when there was a knock on the door. Izuku opened it to find Tails waiting there. Izuku smiled at him, opening the door wider. Tails, how's it going? He asked, inviting him inside. Tails smiled at him, walking inside and waving to Amy, who waved back. Well, Sonic's glad you're out of the house, but I just wanted to check up on you guys. Is everything alright around here? He asked, and Izuku nodded. Yep, although I do have a question. How did you get the construction guys to build this house for free? Izuku asked, and Tails giggled at him. I told them that Sonic would give them autographs, he said, and Izuku's eyes widened. Really? They all did that just for an autograph? Izuku asked, and Tails nodded, his smile becoming more sentimental. Sonic's the first person that ever stood up to Eggman. If it wasn't for him, then we'd all probably be his slaves. He saved all of us multiple times. Sonic is known as the savior of Mobians for a reason, Tails explained. Izuku hummed, impressed. Well, that makes sense. Were they happy when they got their autographs? Izuku asked, and Tails nodded, a grin on his face. They looked like little kids, he said, and Izuku smiled in amusement. Tails saying that is pretty ironic. He thought to himself. Well, things are alright over here, Izuku said, and Tails nodded at him, before looking at Amy, his smile fading. And Amy, how are you doing? He asked softly. Amy smiled at him, appreciative. I'm doing better. I also made a decision. I'm going to fight with you guys, she declared, clean high her fists at her sides and looking at Tails with determination. Wait, what? He asked, surprised. Izuku nodded, his mouth set in a soft smile. Yeah, she decided that she wanted to fight against Eggman with you and Sonic. I was against it at first, but she definitely has potential to be a great help in the fight. She's stronger than she looks, I can tell you that, Izuku said, and Amy grinned, proud of herself. I'll see it when I believe it, a new voice said. Izuku, Amy, and Tails turned to see Sonic staring in the doorway. You left this open, by the way, he said, rubbing the underside of his nose. Amy crossed her arms, looking away with a pout at his comment, while Isuku invited him inside. Sonic, why are you here? Tails asked, confused. Sonic grinned at him as he closed the door behind him, rubbing his head affectionately. I wanted to see what had you out the door in such a hurry. You flew away so fast, Sonic said, and Isuku raised an eyebrow. You flew your plane here? He asked Tails, who looked at him in confusion before he realized. Oh, we never told you, Tails said, before his tail started spinning and he levitated off the ground. Isuku took a step back, his eyes wide. What? How? Isuku asked, and Sonic shrugged. Beats me. He can just do that. It's pretty cool if you ask me, Sonic said, and Isuku nodded, quickly going behind Tails to see it. I see ... It's almost like his tails are a propeller. How interesting. Maybe he does it by Isuku said, trailing off into a mess of mutters. Sonic and Tails looked at him in confusion. Never actually seen him do it, Amy commented, and the other two Mobians looked at her, making Amy flinch. Don't look at me like that. He just told me that he has a habit of going on a muttering tangent when he finds something interesting, she said, and Tails blushed, lowering himself to the ground. It's not that impressive, he mumbled, holding one of his tails. What? Don't say that, bud. You're way past cool, Sonic said, giving Tails a noogie. Tails giggled, shaking himself out of it, and Isuku snapped back to reality, smiling at the sight. Yeah, Sonic's right. That's a miracle of life right there. I'm pretty sure I've never seen anything like it, Isuku said, and Tails hummed, blush deepening. Thank you, he said. Sonic chuckled at his reaction, before he walked over to Amy, looking at her with a raised eyebrow. Amy blushed slightly under his scrutiny, before Sonic turned to Isuku, pointing to Amy with a look of boredom. You really think she's strong? She doesn't look all that tough to me. She's so ... How can I say this in the nicest way possible? Sonic said, and Isuku smiled amusement. Well, one thing I can say about her is that she gets angry pretty easily, and that's usually when she gets her strength, he said, pointing to her. Sonic looked up at him, before turning to face the now glaring Amy. He took a step back, chuckling nervously. I didn't mean it. He tried. Yeah, nice try, blue boy. You wanna see strong? She asked, before she summoned her hammer, raising it above her head. Alright, I believe it now, Sonic said. Tails flocked over to her, his eyes wide. Whoa, how'd you do that? He asked, and Amy smiled, shrugging happily. I don't know, I just wanted to clobber Mr. Big Mouth over there and poof. It was in my hands, she explained. Isuku nodded along. That made sense. Amy scanned the hammer, studying its design. Where did this hammer even come from? She thought aloud, and Tails hummed along. I'm not sure ... It just looks like a hammer, but ... It's not. It just appears like this, he asked. Amy nodded. Yeah, it happened when Isuku was attacked by Metal Sonic. He was about to finish Isuku off, when it just appeared in my hands and I swung at him, crumpling his head, Amy said, and Sonic looked at her in surprise. Wait, that was you? He asked, and she nodded. Yeah, what? It's not like he was that strong, Amy said, rolling her eyes. Isuku looked at her, silent for a second. Amy ... That thing was built to combat Sonic. It's made to be durable. You denting it. That's no small feat, Isuku told her, and she looked down at her arms, before she placed the hammer down on the ground, looking at Tails. Can you lift this, please? She asked. Tails looked confused, but he walked up, grabbing the handle and pulling. It didn't budge. Tails backed up, before he twirled his tails, flying up into the air, and grabbing the handle again, trying to lift it from above. Once again, it didn't move an inch. After nearly 15 seconds, he got tired, floating to the ground, his tails twitching. Hey, that might be a new record, Sonic said, patting Tails on the head. Thanks, Sonic, Tails said, panting. Sonic then walked up, spitting on his gloves and rubbing them together. Alright, my turn, he said. Amy cringed as he gripped the handle with his spit-covered gloves, before pulling. Sonic grit his teeth as he pulled with all his might, only to slip and fall into his back, the hammer still not having moved. Geez ... What is that thing made out of? He asked, getting to his feet. Isuku stepped up to the hammer, grabbing it with both hands and lifting. He hummed as he lifted it above his head, surprised. Wow, I see why you two had so much trouble lifting this. This has to weigh at least 80 pounds, he said, handing it back to Amy, who held it effortlessly. What are you guys talking about? This is really light, Amy said, holding the hammer up over her head with ease. Isuku put his hand to his chin, surprised that he hadn't thought of this earlier. Amy, you dragged me in here right? All on your own? He asked, making Sonic and Tails look at her in surprise. Amy nodded hesitantly. Yeah, she confirmed. Izuku looked up for a second before looking back down at her with a serious stare. Amy, I weigh around 260 pounds without my gear on. With it, it rounds to 300. He told her, and she looked at Izuku, mouth open in surprise. What? There's no way. You're joking, she said, and Izuku shook his head. I can't lift that much, she yelled, her hammer dissipating into sparkles. Izuku hummed before walking outside. Follow me, all of you, he said, and they all walked outside. The sun was setting, and Sonic was tapping his foot impatiently. Look, I don't know how long this is gonna take, but it's nearly Tails' bedtime, he said, pointing to Tails, who yawned. Izuku nodded. Don't worry, this will only take a bit. Do any of you know where the nearest junkyard is? Izuku asked, and Tails told him there was one only a few miles west. Izuku thanked him and launched into the air. Nearly a minute later, he came back, black whip wrapped around a large chunk of scrap. He lowered it to the ground before covering the surface area in black whip. The large chunk was easily twice his size and had to weigh an insane amount. He placed it on the ground, looking at Amy. Can you lift that? He asked. Amy stared at him, crossing her arms in discomfort. You tell me. You're the smart one here, she said. Izuku sighed, lifting the pile of scrap with one hand, electricity dancing around him. Just try please, he asked, exasperated, before setting it in the ground. Amy sighed, walking up to the scrap pile and shifting her fingers under it. She attempted to lift it, visibly struggling. She looked back, shaking her head. Izuku hummed before he snapped. Hey Amy, Sonic just said your quills look stupid, Izuku said, and Sonic turned to him, stumbling over his words. Amy looked back at Sonic, a glare on her face. However, the pile still didn't move. Never mind, must have been the wind, Izuku said, shaking his head before an idea came to his head. He cringed at it, but it made sense. What if her strength came from ... Yes, that worked. Izuku looked back up to see Amy fall back onto her ass, panting. I can't do it, she muttered, but Izuku walked up to her, kneeling down and putting a hand on her shoulder. Amy, I have an idea. You're probably not going to like it, but Izuku said, being interrupted by Amy. Just ... Tell me, Izuku, she said, getting back to her feet. Izuku took a breath before speaking. I want you to try and lift the pile again, but think of something that makes you really angry while you do it, he told her. She raised an eyebrow before she sighed, stretching. Fine, but if this doesn't work, I'm done for the night, she said, and Izuku nodded. Sonic tapped his foot as Tails dozed off. Can you guys hurry it up over there? He asked impatiently. Both Amy and Izuku gave Sonic a look, and he rolled his eyes, lying down and talking his face with his index finger. Amy took a deep breath, walking over to the pile of scrap and digging her fingers under it once more. She closed her eyes, the image of Sonic blowing her off flying through her mind. She started lifting, struggling to even attempt to budge it. Of course, it didn't even move. I need to get angrier, she thought, thinking of Metal Sonic, and how she had offered him a chance at freedom, and how he had spat on the idea, and nearly killed her friend. Sonic stopped tapping his face as the pile of scrap moved an inch, and Izuku smiled. Angrier, Amy thought, the idea of a sinister grin staring at her, the sight of smoke in the background. A vein bulged out of Amy's forehead as the pile of scrap slowly lifted, Amy straightening her back. Izuku laughed, pumping his fist as Sonic's jaw fell. Amy stood triumphantly, holding the massive pile of scrap over her head, before she screamed, throwing it nearly a foot away from her. Tails was shaken back to reality as the loud crash startled him. What? He asked, his tails flicking around. She ... She actually did it, Sonic murmured. Izuku ran over to Amy as she panted, before she fell backwards. Izuku gently caught her in his arms, looking down at her with a proud smile. You did it. You really did it, he said, and she smiled, exhausted. Yeah, I'm pretty awesome, she said, panting, before her eyes closed and her breathing slowed. Izuku looked back at Sonic and Tails, smiling. He walked over to them, carrying Amy in a bridal style. Thank you two for coming along. I'm gonna head in for the night. See you too, he said, before walking back to his house, opening and closing the door with black whip. Sonic blinked before zipping to his feet. He looked to the side to see Tails yawning and smiled at him. Come on buddy, let's get you to bed, he said, grabbing Tails' shoulder and walking back to his cottage. Izuku sighed as he looked at Amy's bed sheets. Not only was her bed more uncomfortable than his, but now it was also stained by his blood. He turned around, carrying Amy to his bed and lying her down, before lying down himself. He had to admit, he was proud of Amy for what she did. He yawned, pulling the blanket over himself and his friend, nestling deeper into his sheets. Maybe staying here ... isn't such a bad idea, he thought to himself, quickly falling asleep.
Izuku awoke to the sound of heavy knocking on the door. He winced, sitting up. He looked to his side, noticing that Amy was still sound asleep, and he stood up, walking out to the living room and opening the door to see Sonic glaring at him. "Hey, you kind telling me what this is about?" he asked, and Izuku looked behind him before stepping outside, closing the door behind him. "Sonic, what are you talking about?" he asked, and Sonic threw a bundled-up newspaper at him. Izuku caught it before opening it, and the headline made him do a double take. "What? Masked menace attacks random civilians in broad daylight." He read aloud. "A man in a green costume has been publicly seen to attack multiple civilians in the street, breaking multiple bones and sending them all to the hospital. If you see someone in a dark green costume at the height of 59, contact your local authorities immediately." He read, eyes wide. "So, you got an explanation?" he asked, and Izuku sighed, rubbing his hand down his face. "This is moronic. Yesterday, Amy went out for groceries alone when I was in the shower, and when I got out, I flew outside looking for her. While I was looking, I spotted some people dragging a Mobian in an alley and decided to check it out. They tried to pull his teeth out. I intervened and took them out, but Amy ran into me, telling me to stop. One of the men pulled a gun in her, but I took the bullet, and that's why Amy had to drag me inside," Izuku explained, and Sonic's glare disappeared, replaced with a look of understanding. "I see. That sounds like the poachers. Those racist bastards," Sonic said, slamming his fist into his palm. Izuku raised an eyebrow, and Sonic sighed. "They're a gang of humans that have recently started expanding in Central City. They think the idea of living with Mobians is disgusting, and have killed multiple," Sonic said, putting his hands on his hips. Izuku hummed, a disgusted look on his face. "That's disgusting. Why do these people think I just randomly attacked some people?" Izuku asked, and Sonic sighed. "Humans are far more likely to believe other humans over Mobians, no matter how sad it is," Sonic explained, and Izuku grumbled. "Well, that's simply stupid," he said, and Sonic shrugged. "What can you do? We don't pick what we are, but not everyone sees that. They see us for what we look like, not who we are. I've been trying to change that ... but I don't know how much I can," Sonic explained sadly. Izuku thought to himself before he nodded. "Well, thank you for the insight, Sonic. I believe I have some business in Central City," he said before jumping off. Sonic looked at him go, eyes wide. Central City. Didn't he just read that he's wanted there? He asked himself before he sighed. "Whatever, I have to go check on Tails," he said, zipping away. Izuku flew over the city skyline. Looking down at the city, he looked around for a place to land, spotting a rooftop that was particularly high up. He slipped his mask over his head before diving down, doing a flip midair, and landing on his feet. He looked around, seeing a couple looking at him, eyes wide and jaws dropped. He waved. "Sorry if I scared you," he said, walking over to the edge of the building. He looked down at the people meandering around. "Why, you're the masked menace," the woman said, and Izuku nodded without looking at them. "Don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you. The reason I attacked those people was because they were trying to hurt someone. They were part of a gang called the Poachers. Do either of you happen to know anything about them?" Izuku asked, grunting when they shook their heads. "All right, thank you for your time," Izuku said, before he jumped off the edge of the building, flying away. He looked down, trying to spot any more secluded spaces he could land, before he scoffed. This wouldn't work. He couldn't just go around telling everyone that he wasn't actually evil. He looked around, before spotting a clothing store. A smile found its way to his face. "I need some rings," he muttered, flying away at high speeds. Izuku ignored the stares as he walked inside the clothing store. People looked at him with pale faces and shocked grimaces. Izuku browsed around, picking out a white t-shirt and black jeans, along with some simple black sneakers. "Do you mind if I try these on?" he asked, and the man shook his head rapidly, fearing for his safety. Izuku smiled, walking into one of the changing rooms and using Black Whip for a barricade at the door. He quickly took his costume off, trying on all the clothes and smiling when they fit well. He then quickly slipped his costume back up, before Black Whip reached into his belt and grabbed a small pile of rings, slithering out the room and placing them on the counter in front of the man, who looked at them with wide eyes. Izuku then lifted the window of the changing booth, jumping out of it and using Black Whip to close it on his way out. Izuku grinned at his clothes, back to his house. Izuku grinned as nobody batted an eye at the casually dressed 17-year-old, although a few people did look at his scars strangely, especially the new one on his cheek. He walked along the sidewalk, blending into the public. Sure, he stood out a little bit with his dark green hair, but he doubted that would be a problem. He did have one complaint though. This shirt was a little tight. He had gotten so used to the costume being nearly skin tight that he didn't notice that the shirt felt the exact same. He winced as he garnered a few more stares, particularly from women. He did not like this kind of attention. He inwardly sighed in relief that he still wasn't as much of a nervous wreck as he was a few years ago. Maybe he could use this. He stopped a woman who looked at him, rubbing the back of his head with a nervous smile. Excuse me, ma'am, but I'm kind of new here. I've heard something about a gang called the Poachers. What am I supposed to expect around here? He asked, attempting to sound nervous. The woman smiled at him, nodding her head. Oh, I can tell you how to stay safe from them. They usually go after Mobians, but they attack humans who don't follow their agenda sometimes. It's pretty scary. If you want to stay safe, then just make sure to stay inside at night. That's when they're usually active, she said, and Isuku smiled at her. That was important. Ah, thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your help, he said, before walking away. He continued this strategy for around 20 minutes, stopping people around the street. Not everyone helped, of course, some simply walking away uncomfortably, but he did get some good info. So, they patrol at night, usually travel in groups of 4 to 6, and almost always carry weapons of some sort. That should be enough for now, Isuku muttered to himself, tapping his chin. Hey, Greenie, someone yelled. Isuku ignored it, walking away from the city. I need to find a secluded place so that I can, Isuku thought, being interrupted by a hand being roughly placed on his shoulder. Isuku tensed, almost activating OFA on instinct. However, he simply turned around, a glare on his face. Yes? He asked, seeing a scowling man in sunglasses looking at him. He wore all black clothing and his hair was styled in an obnoxious mohawk. I heard you was asking around about us, the man said, and Izuku's eyes widened. It's a poacher, Isuku thought to himself. He turned around fully, looking at the man in the face. What? I don't remember asking about a guy with a mohawk, Isuku said, sounding unsure. The man blanched before he scowled. What? No, us, as in our gang, the man said, and it was apparent that they were garnering some attention. Isuku raised his hands, taking a step back. Well, I don't know what you're talking about, man. I just moved here. I didn't even know there was a gang around here, Isuku said, feigning confusion and nervousness. The man sneered at him, pulling a butterfly knife out of a pocket, spinning it around with a flare. Isuku then looked behind the man, gasping and pointing. It's the masked menace, he yelled, and the man and plenty of civilians turned around. What? He asked, and Isuku bolted. Wait, you jackass. Get back here, the man yelled, and Isuku turned into an alley, using OFA to jump on a rooftop. He looked down with a grin as the man ran into the alley, looking around, confused. Isuku shook his head in amusement, before jumping away. Heading back to his house, unaware of the pair of curious eyes on him. A blonde woman lowered her binoculars as Isuku flew away, smiling to herself. Well, aren't you interesting? She muttered, before heading back inside. Isuku landed softly outside of the house, before gently opening the door, walking inside and closing it. He tiptoed to his room, seeing that Amy wasn't there anymore. He raised an eyebrow, wondering where she was, before he heard a door open. He turned around to see Amy walking out of the bathroom, clothed in nothing but a towel around her body. Isuku froze as Amy spotted him, freezing as well. They both blushed crimson, and Isuku turned away as Amy yelped. Sorry, he yelled, finding the wooden wall very interesting. It's fine, Amy said back, and Isuku put his hands up to his face, attempting to walk away while covering his eyes. He failed, of course, bumping into 3 walls in the first 5 seconds. He cursed under his breath as Amy giggled at him. All right, I'm good now, she said, and Isuku exhaled in relief, uncovering his eyes. He looked Amy to see her fully dressed now, though her quills weren't styled the way they normally were. They hung down her back, and he had to admit, it made her look more mature. Your quills ... they're not styled, he asked, and Amy winced. Yeah, I ran out of gel. I'm probably gonna get more later, she said, and Isuku smiled at her. Honestly, they look better like that, Isuku said, walking away. Amy blushed, staring at him as he walked away. Do they? She thought, walking back into the bathroom. Isuku was still a little red from what just happened, but he calmed down a bit. He walked over to the washer, smiling when he saw that his costume was fully washed. He then switched it over to the dryer, turning it on and walking back into the living room. Amy walked out of the bathroom, playing with her hands, a blush on her face. So I thought about it a little bit ... Do you think I should stop styling my quills like Sonic's? She asked, looking up at Isuku, who grinned at her. You do whatever you want with them, but in my opinion, yes, you look more like your own person, he said, and Amy's eyes widened, before she smiled. Thanks, she said, looking down with her blush returning. Isuku raised an eyebrow. Is it hot in here or something? He thought, confused why her face kept getting so red. Isuku shook his head, looking at Amy with a smile. So, you're a lot stronger than you look, Isuku said, changing the subject to Amy's relief. Yeah, I guess my emotional state is what dictates my strength. Kinda cliche, but I can't say it doesn't make sense, she said, looking down at her body. Isuku hummed, tapping his chin. What you lifted should have weighed around 5 tons, he said, and Amy stared at him. Isuku sighed. That equals 10,000 pounds, he said, and Amy's eyes shot wide open, her jaw dropping. I lifted 10,000 pounds, she asked, and Isuku nodded. That number could go higher if you train enough, Izuku said offhandedly. Amy put her hands to chin, thinking to herself. Izuku, she asked, staring up at him with wide eyes and a small smile. Izuku raised an eyebrow. She was looking at him the same way he looked at his mother when he wanted something. Could you teach me how to fight, instead of just sparring? She asked, and Izuku shrugged. Yeah, I don't see why not, he said, and Amy pouted. But you know that I can wait, really? She asked. Izuku looked at her, nodding. I mean, it would kind of be a waste not to. I can definitely teach you how to fight. Well, kickbox, at least, Izuku said, standing up. Amy jumped with a grin before Izuku walked over to the fridge, opening it. After we have lunch, he finished, and right on cue, Amy's stomach growled. Izuku looked at her as she blushed in embarrassment, holding her stomach. Sorry, she said, and Izuku chuckled in amusement before opening the pantry, grinning at what we saw. We have the ingredients to make pancakes, if you want, Izuku said, and Amy gasped. Pancakes? I haven't had those in ages, she said, and Izuku grabbed the flour, baking powder, salt, and sugar from the pantry. He placed them on the table as Amy grabbed a few large bowls from around the house, placing them on the table. Izuku then grabbed milk, eggs, and butter from the fridge, placing them next to the dry ingredients. Izuku smiled at Amy's help, before asking her if she's ever made pancakes before. She shook her head, and Izuku nodded, telling her what to do. Here, I'll handle the dry ingredients. Have you ever cracked an egg before? Izuku asked, and she nodded. All right, I'll need you to crack one egg and place the inside in the bowl closest to you. Once you do that, take a third of this stick of butter and melt it. Once that's done, place it in the same bowl, he said, and she nodded, walking off to do her part. Izuku then looked around for the silverware drawer, smiling when he found it. He took out the half measuring cup and a teaspoon. He then added 1/2 cups of flour to the dry bowl, 3/2 teaspoons of baking powder, 2 teaspoons of sugar, and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. He grabbed the spoon and started stirring, shaking the bowl as he did it. After a minute, the mixture was finished. He then looked at Amy, who just finished her steps. Izuku took a look at the mixture, grinning. Good job. Now, you need to add 1/4 cups of milk to your bowl, he said, and she nodded, rushing over to the drawer that had the utensils in it. She grabbed the 1/4 measuring cup, filling it and dumping it into the wet bowl 5 times. Izuku gave her a thumbs up as she put the milk away, and the measuring cup in the sink. All right, now you just pour the wet ingredients into the dry ingredients and whisk, and you have pancake batter. Do you want to mix the ingredients? Izuku asked, and she nodded with an excited smile. She grabbed a whisk from the utensils drawer and started roughly mixing, making Izuku wince. There's no need to be so rough with it. You should definitely use some force, but not too much. Oh, and make sure to switch directions from time to time to get it thoroughly mixed, Izuku advised, and Amy nodded, sticking her tongue out slightly as she took his advice. With only a few minutes, the batter was finished, a pale golden color. Good job, Amy. Now, let me just get the stove on, Izuku said, turning one of the 4 dials. A small ring of blue flame popped up from the stove, and Izuku got a pan out, placing it on the hot metal. He then used black whip to cut a small thing of butter and toss it onto the pan, spreading it around as it melted. Hand me the batter, please, Izuku said, and Amy carefully handed the bowl to Izuku, who drizzled a decent amount onto the pan, watching as it sizzled. A trick my mother taught me was to wait until there were bubbles all along the batter to flip it over, he said, watching as air bubbles formed in the batter. After a few moments, Izuku grabbed a spatula, flipping the half-cooked pancake to reveal the perfect golden brown pancake. After around 30 minutes, there was no more batter left, and a stack of pancakes on a nearby plate. All right, if you could take this plate to the table, that would be much appreciated, Izuku said, grabbing the hot pan as Amy quickly grabbed the plate. Izuku then rinsed the pan, watching steam rise off of it before he placed it in the sink. After placing the stack of pancakes on the table, she got 2 more plates from the cupboard, placing them on either side of the table, along with forks and knives. Izuku left to go change into his costume. He has admitted to Amy that he felt safer in the costume, no matter how unhealthy that was. After he slipped his costume off, he put the casual clothes in the washer. They sat down, each taking a few of the pancakes, smiling at how good they tasted. If we had maple syrup, these would be the best pancakes I've ever had, Amy said, and Izuku smiled. I'm glad. You were a great help in making them, he told her, and she smiled back, pride on her face, before her eyes widened and she pulled something out of her shirt pocket. Izuku raised an eyebrow as she looked at it. I've been meaning to ask you. I found this on the bathroom floor before I took my shower last night. What is it? She asked, handing it to him. Izuku grabbed it, his eyes widening as he gazed at one of the only things he took with him. A picture of him at UA with the rest of his classmates. He shifted as he saw how everyone in the picture was smiling happily, and he closed his eyes to stop them from watering. His mouth shifted to a set line, folding the picture up and putting it away. Don't worry, it isn't important, he said, shaking his head and going back to his meal. Amy looked at him strangely. What? But I want to know. It's important enough for me, she said, and Isuku shook his head. I understand that, but… No, sorry, but I'm not telling you, he said, and she crossed her arms, looking at him with a questioning stare. Why not? Is it a long story or something? She asked, and Isuku paused. Yes, it's a long story. I'm sure you have things to do, Isuku said, going back to his food. Nope, not really. I don't mind. Just tell me, she pleaded, and Isuku gripped his fork tighter, glaring at her, beginning to get irritated. No, drop it. I'm serious, he warned, and she pouted. Why though? Can you at least tell me why? She asked, and Isuku scowled, slamming his fork onto the table. No, I don't have to tell you everything about my life back on Earth, he said, and she looked at him, ears drooping. I just thought, she started, and Isuku shook his head. Well, you thought wrong. When I don't want to tell you something, that means you're not hearing it. Got it? He asked, staring at her. Why yes, Isuku, she said softly. Isuku nodded, before standing up. I'm going out, he said, looking back at her, seeing her look down at her pancakes with drooped ears and a wobbly frown. His eyes softened, before he shook his head. Him, he said, before walking out, closing the door behind him. He sighed to himself, shaking his head. Was I too harsh? Ugh, I'll apologize to her later. I need to clear my head, Isuku said, walking away from the house and jumping away, flying around. Flying listlessly has always cleared his head and calmed him down. It was actually one of his favorite things to do, along with fighting and heroics. Isuku looked down as he flew, shaking his head. Maybe I'll explore a bit more. I don't really know much about this place, he muttered, zipping off. An hour and a half later, Isuku was flying back home, visibly calmer. I might have lost track of time, but it's fine. I need to get home and apologize to Amy for snapping at her like that, Isuku said, flying faster. In minutes, he landed on the now familiar grassy plains, walking up to the cracked open door. Did he slam the door and break it or something? He walked inside, his eyes widening at the sight of the flipped-over table, 4 large claw marks dug into it. Isuku froze, his body going cold. No, he thought. Amy, he asked, his voice shaky. He looked around, seeing that one of the chairs was broken, and that her door had a large hole in it. He rushed into her room, seeing it in disarray, but no Amy. Amy, he asked again, looking around frantically. She can't be gone. Where is she? He thought to himself. Amy, this isn't funny. Amy, he yelled, running into each and every room in the house, looking for her. He grit his teeth when he didn't find her. Amy, please, I'm sorry for telling it you earlier. I'll tell you about the picture, just come out, he yelled. Nothing. Isuku clenched his fists. If someone took her, all he started. Black whip itching to tear the area around him to shreds when he heard a click behind him. He turned, eyes full of relief, only for them to glare at the small motobug that had a slip of paper tied to its back. Isuku stomped towards it, ripping the tape off of it and pushing it away from him. He unfolded the paper, his eyes widening in rage. He really thought I wouldn't find her, it said in blocky red handwriting. Electricity surrounded him like a thunderstorm, burning the paper to ash, and zapping the motobug, exploding it. A tiny bird flew out of the wreckage, escaping with a grateful tweet that Isuku didn't even hear. Isuku looked out the open door, before he sprinted outside, and took off at supersonic speeds, creating a powerful shockwave. Sonic was relaxing in his house with Tails when they heard the loud boom from outside. Tails jumped, and Sonic flinched, before his face grew serious. Stay here. If it's something important, I'll tell you over the radio. Make sure to keep yours on, Sonic said, before zipping out the door and following the trail of burning grass. Isuku didn't look behind him as he heard the sound of quickly pattering feet catching up to him. I didn't know you were this fast, Isuku. A familiar voice spoke, making Isuku grunt. I don't have time to entertain you or Tails. Robotnik took Amy, he said, making Sonic's eyes widen. What? He asked, jumping over a rock. They made it to the chains, keeping Little Planet from floating away. We had an argument, and I stormed out to clear my head. When I came back, our house was in shambles, and she was nowhere to be found. A badnik came to my door with a note attached. If you want to help me get her back, then hop on my back, Isuku said, grunting when he felt something light hop onto his back. He used Black Whip to make sure Sonic was secure before he sped up. He flew up, looking down at Little Planet with scrutiny, spotting Eggman's base. He flew at top speed, making it there in seconds, and slammed through the roof, flying through multiple floors, using Black Whip to guard Sonic from any debris, before something slammed into his side, halting his momentum and throwing Sonic off of him. They both caught themselves midair, landing on their feet. They looked up to see Eggman grinning, with a newly repaired Metal Sonic staring at them. There you are, you repugnant rodents. I see Metal Sonic MK. 2 has already introduced himself, Eggman said, grinning evilly. Izuku scowled, rushing forwards and rearing his fast back towards Eggman, only for Metal Sonic to slam into him again, carrying him outside the building. Eggman looked at Sonic, seeing him running to him. Eggman pressed a button, his egg mobile ejecting out of the ground under him. "It's just you and I, you heinous hedgehog. Doesn't this bring back such tender memories?" he asked, firing a missile at the blue blur, who jumped over it. "Not in the slightest, egghead," he yelled back. Back with Izuku. Their surroundings were blurring as Metal Sonic carried him, and Izuku grunted in annoyance, slamming his fists into Metal's back, causing his turbine to short-circuit, and for them to fall to the ground. They landed roughly on a long winding road, rolling for a few meters before they stopped. Metal got to his feet slowly, while Izuku performed a handspring, recovering immediately. He looked at the robot, his eyes crackling with power. "Where's Amy?" he asked, but Metal stayed silent. Izuku grunted, slipping his hood and rebreather over his head. Izuku rushed forwards, and Metal ducked under the swift punch that Izuku delivered, before punching him in the jaw, making Izuku stumble backwards. He grabbed his jaw, glaring back at Metal. "You're faster and stronger," Izuku commented, before becoming a blur, a streak of green lighting following his every move. Metal Sonic's eyes moved around, following his movements at an insane speed. He caught a punch, sidestepped a kick, countered a knee, and Izuku grit his teeth in annoyance. It's like Metal Sonic knew everything he was going to do. Izuku jumped up, attempting to land an axe kick on Metal's head, only for the robot to disappear, slamming into his back. Izuku yelped in pain as he flew forwards, just barely dodging the following energy attack. Izuku ducked under the next one, before he flipped forwards, Black Whip shooting out of his boots and cracking at Metal, who dodged each and every one of them, but he couldn't dodge the overhead swipe from Izuku, causing him to fall to the ground. Metal Sonic quickly got to his feet though, a decent dent in his head. Izuku scoffed. Powering up to 30%, Metal Sonic moved first this time, his turbine roaring to life as he shot forwards, claws at the ready. He took multiple swipes at Izuku, who dodged the first 2, however, he did get tagged by the third one. He growled, catching Metal's arm, and pulling him into a right hook that broke the sound barrier. Metal flew backwards and Izuku's grip on his arm remained true, causing it to be ripped from its socket. Izuku scowled at the arm, crushing the wrist in his grip, before throwing it to the ground. He then zipped forward, seeing sparks fly from Metal Sonic's arm socket as he struggled to get up. Izuku walked forward, grabbing Metal Sonic's head. He used gearshift, speeding Metal Sonic's head up, and simultaneously slowing it down with both hands. Space warped around Metal's head before it was crumpled by physics. Izuku huffed, taking a step back before he reached down, grabbing Metal's limp body by his torso. Sonic yelped as he was hit by one of the missiles, and Eggman cheered. "Take that, you bumbling blue hedge rat," Eggman said, before something flew over him, slamming into the wall and embedding itself there. Both Sonic and Eggman turned to see Metal's corpse hanging unceremoniously from the wall, and they turned to see Izuku flying in from the wall he was sent through, slamming his fist into Eggman's egg mobile. Eggman yelped as the vehicle exploded, crashing to the ground. Eggman rubbed his head as Izuku slammed down in front of him, his eyes glowing, an unstable look shining in them. "Where is she?" he growled, and Eggman grinned. "Oh, the little Rose. She was well behaved on her way here, so I made it quick for her GAK. Eggman taunted, before Izuku punched him in the jaw with a loud crack. Sonic winced at the power of the blow. Izuku?" he asked as he punched Eggman again, knocking his glasses off his face. "Izuku?" he asked again, flinching as the next attack nearly took the doctor's head off. "Izuku," he yelled, and Izuku screamed in rage, grabbing the doctor by his jacket. "Where is she?" he asked, and the doctor twitched, sparking with electricity. Izuku's eyes widened as the doctor's head ejected from the body, a spring bouncing around in the robot's body. Izuku panted, dropping the decoy. "Just a robot," Izuku spat, kicking the robotic corpse. Sonic stared at him with wide eyes as he panted, but he either didn't notice or care. "Let's go," he said, walking away from the gruesome sight. Sonic watched him go, swallowing nervously. I don't know if I feel safe living near this guy anymore," Sonic thought to himself, cautiously following him. Izuku put his hands to his mouth, yelling loudly. "Amy, where are you? Yell back if you can hear me," he yelled. It was silent, save for the echoes of his own voice. "No, she has to be here," Izuku whispered to himself, clenching his fists, when suddenly "Izuku, is that you? Help me," she yelled, and Izuku perked up, zipping towards the noise. Sonic stayed behind, taking another look at the still robotic doctor. Izuku slid to a stop, looking around. "I need you to yell again," Izuku said, waiting for a response. "I'm in a dark room. You sound close." He heard to his left. He looked to his side, seeing at least a dozen doors. He slammed each one open, getting more and more frantic each time that he didn't see Amy, until he finally spotted her in a thick tube made out of some sort of plastic polyresin material. He ripped his mask off, staring at Amy with wide eyes as she grinned back, tears in her eyes. I was so scared. I was waiting for you to come back. And I heard the door open and turned to see Metal Sonic. I tried to fight him, but he didn't budge. And I tried hiding, but he found me and I thought I was going to die. He knocked me out and when I woke up, I was in this tube that I couldn't break and Amy rambled. Before Isuku grabbed the tube, instantly shattering it. Tears flowed down his face as he dove forward, hugging Amy. She took a step back in surprise as he wrapped his arms around her. I am so sorry. ISH shouldn't have snapped at you. You're the only thing I have now. Isuku yelled, making Amy's eyes widen. What are you talking about, Isuku? She asked, grabbing his face and making him look into her eyes. He sniffled, looking down, before he reached into his belt, pulling out his picture from before. These people they were basically family to me. I spent years with them. I cared so much about all of them and they they're all gone. Isuku said, pausing to take a shaky breath. Every single one of them, along with my mother and All Might. I have nothing left, Amy, nothing but you. I am sorry for refusing to tell you earlier, but it just hurts so much to think about them. Isuku said, sobbing. Amy looked at the picture, her face set in a sympathetic frown. Oh, Isuku, I'm also sorry for pushing you to tell me something you clearly didn't want to. I was inconsiderate, and it wasn't fair to you. You're allowed to have your secrets, and it's wrong to try and make you tell me them, she said, and Isuku gripped her tighter, tears filling up his eyes once more. He didn't want to admit it, but he was definitely becoming dependent on the girl. He couldn't help it though. He had been alone for over a year, and he hadn't been this close with someone in a long time. He felt like he had known her for years. Amy looked down at him sadly as he sobbed into her shoulder. It was weird seeing someone so undoubtedly mighty cry like this. It made her sad, but not the normal sad. It made her sad in the sense that she wanted nothing more than to cheer him up, to make him smile again. She looked up, a determined look in her eyes. Don't worry, Isuku. I'm not going anywhere anytime soon, she said softly, and Isuku closed his eyes. God, this is pathetic, he muttered after calming himself down a bit. She hummed, shaking her head, running her hand through his hair as a way to calm him down more. No, it's not. It's okay to need to cry on someone's shoulder from time to time. You can't always be strong. I don't expect that out of you, and you shouldn't expect that out of yourself, she said, and Isuku sniffled, getting to his feet. Amy smiled softly at him. Feeling better, she asked, and he smiled back, but it was smaller than usual. A bit. Thank you, Amy. I don't know what I'd do without you, he said, and she grinned back. You'd go crazy without me here to keep you in check, she said, and Isuku laughed weakly. That's more true than you think, he said, and she rolled her eyes. Drama queen, she replied, and he smiled. There you guys are. I swiped a few chaos emeralds from one of the rooms while you guys were gone. Let's get out of here, Sonic yelled, rushing out of the building. Chaos emerald? Isuku asked Amy, who shook her head. I'll explain on the way, she said, jumping into his arms and nestling her face into Izuku's chest. Isuku ran forward before jumping, quickly flying out of the building. He looked down to see Sonic racing away, running down one of the chains. Hold on tight, Isuku warned, before he sped up, quickly catching up to Sonic. So, what are Chaos Emeralds? Isuku asked, and Amy hummed. I don't know much about them, other than the fact that they're really powerful and really ancient artifacts. One alone is strong enough to take down armies, but all 7 of them. You'd probably be the most powerful being in the universe, she explained, and Izuku's eyes widened. Whoa ... and Eggman had 3 of them, Isuku asked, making Amy giggle. He and Sonic always race to find them first when they scatter. Luckily, Sonic usually finds at least one before Eggman can get his greedy hands on them, she said, and Isuku nodded, smiling. Well, that's certainly a relief, he said, before they slowed down. All right, we're off, little planet. You want me to slow down, or just get us home? Isuku asked. Amy looked down, admiring the view for a few seconds. Take us home quickly, please, she asked, and he nodded, zipping away. Within minutes, he landed down in the soft grass in front of their home, and he winced at the door still being open. He entered the house, and Amy was about to follow when a voice stopped her. Psst, Amy, she heard. She turned to see Sonic gesturing towards her. Get over here, he said. She walked towards him, looking at him strangely. Sonic, what's wrong? She asked, and he looked over her shoulder to see if Isuku was listening, before he looked at Amy again. Do you want another place to stay? He asked randomly, causing her eyes to widen in surprise. No, Isuku and I are fine here, she said, and Sonic winced. Are you sure? I can set you up a nice beachside house, he said, smiling nervously at her. She blinked in surprise before she hummed with a smile. That actually sounds lovely. Let me go ask Isuku if she started, only for Sonic to grab her arm. Wait, I was thinking ... only setting you up there, without Isuku near you at all, he said, and Amy looked at him, narrowing her eyes. Sonic, why do you want me to be away from Isuku? She asked, and he winced, before shaking his head, looking at her with a serious gaze. There's something up with him. He's ... he's not okay ... up there. You know, he asked, and Amy crossed her arms, growing more irritated. No, Sonic, I don't know. There's nothing wrong with Isuku, she said, and Sonic frowned. Amy, he looked unstable when he fought that Eggman decoy. Hell, he punched his head off. He was lucky that it was a robot decoy, Sonic said, and Amy scowled at him. I'm not abandoning my friend. Even if he did have some issues, I still wouldn't just leave him, Amy said, glaring at her former crush. Sonic groaned. Amy, you're not listening, he said, and Amy shook her head. No, you're not listening. Izuku cares about me, and is actively doing his best to make sure that I have someone to rely on. That's more than I can say about you, she said, before turning away and walking back to the house. Amy, you didn't see him. He was acting like a wild animal, he said, and Amy turned around with a gasp. Sonic cringed, realizing he probably shouldn't have said that. Really, you're calling him slurs now, she said, and Sonic stumbled over his words, trying desperately to convince Amy that Izuku was dangerous. No, let me tell you something, quick shot. Izuku has done nothing but care for me, and treat me with respect, which is something that you've never had the decency to do. So sure, maybe he has a few screws loose, but at least he doesn't just blow me off like you did. In fact, I'd choose him over you any day of the week, she said, poking him in his chest and sending him stumbling backwards. As a boyfriend or a roommate? Sonic asked, and Amy's face went red with embarrassment and anger. In general, you dimwit, she yelled, before storming inside. Sonic stared at the house, before throwing his arms up in frustration. Fine, but if he goes ballistic, expect an I told you so, Sonic yelled. A white glove popped out of the doorway, and Amy flipped him off before closing the door. Sonic gasped at the sight, before glaring, turning around and walking away. Why are girls so complicated? He whispered. Amy sighed as she closed the door. She had a crush on that guy. Yikes, talk about low standards. He's not wrong, you know, a voice said, startling Amy. She looked over to see Izuku setting the table back up, trying to ignore the claw marks. I'm not ... the most mentally stable person around. Just because I'm careful around you doesn't mean I don't have issues, Izuku said, and Amy smiled at him. You really think I care? Everyone has problems, even Sonic, though he probably won't admit it, Amy said, glaring back at the door. Just ... don't hold it against him. He's only trying to keep you safe. I would do the same if I was in his position, Izuku said, and Amy shook her head, sighing. You don't get it, Izuku. He doesn't get to say that stuff about you when you've done more for me than he ever even tried to. Instead of just blowing me off like he did, you talked to me. You got to know me instead of just ignoring me. You ... you care about me, and I care about you. It's gonna take a lot more than you having a dark side to get rid of me, Amy said, crossing her arms. Izuku stared at her for a second, before his eyes filled with tears. That was so nice. I really don't deserve you, he said, crying rivers. Amy winced as the house flooded with tears. Aw, Izuku, you got my skirt wet, she said, and Izuku sniffled, rubbing his eyes. Sorry, Amy, he said. Amy rolled her eyes, grinning in poorly hidden amusement. Well, I'm exhausted. Do you mind if we push back that training stuff tomorrow? Being kidnapped and rescued again is pretty draining, she said as Izuku dried his eyes. Of course, I'm honestly pretty tired too, Izuku said, yawning on cue. Then his yawn made her yawn. Amy giggled, walking away. Izuku exhaled, standing up and stretching, before walking to his bedroom, where Amy was already laying down. So, do we just share this room now? Izuku asked, and Amy shrugged before she hopped onto the bed, kicking her shoes off lazily. I guess. I haven't really looked too much into it, she said, lying down. Izuku took his gear off, following suit. Yeah, that's fair, he said, lying down with a sigh. It was silent for a minute as Izuku pulled the blanket over him and Amy. A few minutes passed before Amy broke the silence. Izuku, she started. Izuku hummed in response. Have you ever known someone for a little while, but felt like you've known them your whole life? She asked, and Izuku chuckled. Yes, Amy, I have, he said, and she smiled. I figured, she said with a grin, before she closed her eyes for the night. Izuku quickly followed suit, a smile on his face. Sunlight shone over Amy's eyes, making her stir. After a minute, she opened her eyes, before she sat up, looking around wearily. She noticed that she woke up before Izuku this time, and she carefully got out the bed, making sure to not ruffle the sheets too much. She tiptoed out of the room, carefully walking to the bathroom and taking a quick shower. When she got out, she quickly dressed herself in a fresh set of clothes that she had bought herself. They were similar to her ruined green shirt and orange skirt. However, the shirt was a simple red frilly shirt and a red skirt with black shorts underneath. Her shoes and gloves were unchanged though. She was mildly surprised when she peeked inside Izuku's room to find him still asleep. She blinked before putting her hand to her chin. Maybe she could do something for him while he was sleeping, like making breakfast. There were still a good amount of pancakes in the fridge from yesterday, but she wanted to show him that she appreciated him. Amy smiled, walking back to the living room. Opening the fridge, she grabbed the eggs and a bag of bacon before grabbing a few slices of bread. She grabbed the pan from the sink, pouring some soap in it and scrubbing it for a few minutes. Once it was clean enough, she rinsed it off and dried it with a towel, placing it on the stove. She then looked at her ingredients, thinking to herself, "This should be good," she murmured, getting some butter and placing it in the pan, turning the heat onto low. She cracked a few eggs, placing them into the pan, and the shells in the trash. She watched them carefully as they cooked, smiling to herself. Izuku stirred in his sleep as a familiar smell entered his nose. He murmured in his sleep before he slowly opened his eyes. "Is that bacon?" Izuku asked, sitting up and holding his hand to his head. Now that he was a bit more aware, he heard the sizzling of something cooking. He stood up, exhaling as joints cracked and popped. He then walked out to the living room to see 2 plates with eggs and toast on them. He saw Amy at the stove tending to some strips of bacon. He simply stood back, watching her cook. She's wearing some new clothes. They look nice, he thought to himself, before blushing. Wait, what? Geez, Izuku. Think before you think, he said internally. Amy turned around, carrying some bacon with tweezers, jumping slightly when she saw Izuku. "Oh, you're awake. I was planning on bringing you breakfast in bed. But this works too," she said, and Izuku blushed. "That's so kind of you," Izuku said, and Amy smiled. "Well, I wanted you to know that. I appreciate you, and I thought making you breakfast would carry that sentiment," Amy said, blushing slightly. Izuku smiled wholeheartedly at her, genuinely grateful. "Thank you, Ames," he said, and Amy blushed again. "Ames?" she asked, looking up at him. Izuku nodded, looking to the side slightly. "It's a nickname I came up with. Do you like it?" Izuku asked, and Amy smiled at him, her face still slightly red. "Ames, I like it," she said, and Izuku smiled. He rubbed the back of his head as Amy placed some bacon on his plate, before going back to the stove. "Would you like any help?" he asked, and she shook her head. "Nope, all you need to do is just sit down," she said, and Izuku raised an eyebrow. "If you're sure, just let me know if you want help with anything," Izuku said, watching her work. "Wait, has she gotten taller?" Izuku thought to himself, looking at her. Was he just imagining things? She turned to him, and he knew that he didn't imagine it. She had definitely gotten a good bit taller. He smiled at her, making her look at him strangely. Is there something on my face?" "Oh, please tell me there isn't anything in my teeth," she said, and Izuku shook his head. "No, it's nothing like that. You've just gotten taller by a few inches," he said, and her eyes widened. "Oh, awesome. I'll catch up to you eventually," she said with a grin, and Izuku chuckled. "Sure, Ames," he said, making her blush at the use of the nickname. Izuku grabbed the toast, inspecting it. It was a perfect golden brown, with some butter already spread on it. He took a bite, humming pleasantly. "This toast is really good, Amy," he said, and Amy smiled at him, standing as she took a bite of one of her eggs. Izuku looked at her strangely, before remembering that Metal Sonic had broken one of their chairs. Izuku stood up, grabbing his chair. Amy looked at him in confusion as he walked up to her, before he placed the chair behind her, sliding it up to her. "Izuku, that's your chair," she said, and Izuku shrugged. "I can just go get a new one later. Besides, I'm not gonna make you stand, especially after you made this great breakfast," Izuku said, and Amy looked down, face slightly red, before she sat down. "Thank you, Izuku," she muttered. Izuku smiled back. "Of course, Amy," he said, walking back over the table and going back to his food. They ate in a comfortable silence, breaking said silence to talk about their plans for the day. "Oh yeah, you wanted to train today, right?" Izuku asked, pointing his fork at her. She nodded, flexing her skinny arms. "Yep, I want to learn how to fight so I can give Eggman the smackdown that he deserves," she said, losing her enthusiasm through the sentence. Izuku looked at her, worried for a second, before she smiled. "I'm going to avenge my parents, my friends all of them. I'm going to make that bastard pay for what he did," Amy said, and Izuku's eyes widened momentarily at the curse, before he smiled at her. "That's an honorable goal. Just don't focus solely on revenge. Trust me, it won't end well," Izuku said. Amy looked at him sadly for a second. "Speaking from experience?" she asked gently. Izuku looked away, eyes downcast, giving her the answer. Amy nodded. "I won't, Izuku. I swear it," she said, and Izuku smiled at her, pride echoing in his face. "Good. I'm proud of you, Ames," he said, grabbing his empty plate, as well as hers. He placed both their plates and silverware in the sink, before he headed off to the laundry room, switching his casual clothes to the dryer. "Amy, I'm gonna take a shower now," he said across the house. Receiving an okay in return, he stepped into the bathroom. Amy hummed as she made she and Izuku's bed, as well as fluffing the pillows. She smiled at her work before leaving the room. She looked around, seeing that the house was clean enough for her standards. She grinned, putting her hands on her hips. A knock on the door startled her, and she turned around to face it, a frown on her face. "I swear to chaos, if that's Sonic, then I'm gonna lose it," she muttered, opening the door, smiling at the little fox boy who had knocked. "Hello, Tails," she said, and he waved at her. "Hi, Miss Amy. I was wondering if you and Mr. Izuku could hang out with me today. Sonic said he had some errands to run, and told me to stay home, but home is just so boring when he's gone," Tails said, pouting. Amy smiled, stepping outside. "Of course we can spend time with you today. Oh, and by the way, you can drop the miss part and just call me Amy," she said, and Tails nodded. "Okay, Amy," he replied, walking away from the house. "All right, just stay there. I'm going to leave Izuku a note," she said, walking back inside. Izuku was still showering, so she grabbed a slip of paper, wrote what she was doing, and placed it on the table. She debated on drawing a few hearts, but waved that idea away. She didn't want him to think she was coming on to him. She then followed Tails outside, watching as he flew around with a smile. She always liked babysitting children. They were just so adorable, and unlike most people, they actually listened to her. Honestly, the only person to ever actually listen to her that wasn't her parents or a kid was Izuku, and it was very refreshing. She watched as Tails floated to the ground, before he saw a few flickies frolicking, and decided to playfully chase them. Amy then heard the door open and close behind her, and turned around to see Izuku in the clothes that Tails had gifted him, looking at energetic Mobian with a smile. "He's got some energy, I'll give him that," Izuku said, watching as Tails gently pet one of the flickies. However, he quickly noticed Izuku and smiled, standing up and running towards him. "You're here, and you're wearing my gift. You guys want to see something really cool?" Tails asked, and it was clear that he had wanted to show them this for a while. Izuku shrugged. "Sure, Tails," he said, Amy nodding along. Tails told them to wait there, before he quickly used his tails to propel himself towards his house. Izuku turned to Amy, who shrugged. "I have no idea what he's getting. He was just chasing flickies around earlier," she said. Izuku nodded, and he had to admit that he was curious. Just what did he want to show them? Izuku then spotted Tails zooming back towards them, a bag over his shoulder. He looked at the bag curiously as Tails slowed down, sliding on the grass. Tails grinned at them as he grabbed the bag, opening it, before he pulled out a small green emerald. Izuku's eyes widened as Amy gasped. "Is that a Chaos Emerald?" Izuku and Amy asked at the same time, making Tails nod with a smile. "Yeah, isn't it really cool?" he asked, and Izuku had to admit that the gem was absolutely beautiful. It fit in Tails' palm perfectly, the green sheen on it reflecting in Izuku and Amy's eyes. It looked like it was cut by the gods, being perfectly symmetrical. Tails looked down at the emerald, before he held his hand out. "Sonic would probably get mad at me for doing this, but I know you guys want to hold it," Tails said, and Amy immediately twiddled her fingers with a giggle, reaching for it. Izuku winced, clenching his fists in anxiety. He didn't know if he wanted Amy holding a weapon of mass destruction. It's not that he didn't trust her with it, he was just afraid that it would hurt her in some way. The words died in his throat as Amy grabbed the emerald, and nothing happened. She held it, feeling its weight in her palm. It glinted in her hand, and Amy oohed and awed at its beauty before she held it out to Izuku, who looked at it cautiously. He shrugged with a sigh before he reached out to it. However, when his finger got close to it, a bolt of bright green energy shot from the emerald to his finger, and Amy flinched at the feeling of being lightly shocked, dropping the emerald on instinct. Izuku, Amy, and Tails looked on, their eyes widening in panic and shock as it fell, before something indescribable happened. Izuku looked down as his arm twitched, before 8 thick strands of black whip launched out of his arm, grabbing the emerald and pulling to Izuku. Izuku grabbed his wrist in surprise and pain as black whip writhed. What the hell? He strained and Amy looked at him, concerned. "Izuku, are you alright?" she asked, and Izuku clenched his as OFA continued acting on its own. "My quirk. It's doing this on its own. I'm not doing this," Izuku explained frantically, making Amy's eyes widen, and at that very moment, the emerald made contact with Izuku's hand. His body seized as an immeasurable amount of power flowed into him. Black whip writhed in pain. Power? Izuku didn't know. The last thing he saw was Amy's terrified figure rushing towards him, before everything went black. Amy was halfway to Izuku when Black Whip retreated into his arm, the emerald floating slowly to the ground, entirely unchanged. Tails rushed forwards, grabbing it and quickly putting the emerald in the bag, not allowing anyone else to even be near it. He looked back up to see Amy nursing Izuku's limp body, lifting his head and staring at him with tears in her eyes. Izuku, why you have to wake up? What happened? Is this some kind of joke? Please tell me this is a joke," she said, looking at Tails, panicked. His eyes were just as wide. Before he swallowed, his throat dry. I don't know what happened. I've never seen that, Tails said, stunned. Amy's eyes widened and her face paled. She turned back to Isuku, her face one of horror. No. Isuku, please, she yelled, and tears filled Tails' eyes as he stared at Izuku's still body in horror and guilt. Is he thought, before Amy's incredibly relieved gasp brought him back to reality, unintentionally stopping a panic attack. Oh thank God he's breathing he's just unconscious, Amy said, placing a hand over her rapidly beating heart. That was probably the most scared she'd ever been in her life. She could still feel the overwhelming dread as she saw Izuku's eyes roll back into his head. The immediate thought that he was dead flooding her mind. She then looked over to find tears sliding down Tails' wide eyes, and she immediately went to comfort him. Oh, Tails, don't worry. He's fine. It's not your fault this happened, I swear to you. Izuku's power just acts weirdly sometimes. Like one time it randomly woke him up one night. Or so he said but that isn't important. He's alright, Tails. She cooed, making Tails breathing slow. He's fine. I didn't kill him, Tails asked with a terribly heartbreaking horror. Amy shook her head frantically, putting on her best smile for the terrified fox boy. Oh, chaos, no, Tails. You didn't do anything wrong. Come over here, listen. Do you hear him breathing? He's just sleeping right now. He's alright, Amy said softly, calming Tails down. Alright. I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have shown you guys these. I'm really sorry, Amy, Tails said, the tears starting up again. Amy pulled Tails into a comforting hug, rubbing his head like she'd seen Sonic do. No, there's nothing to be sorry about, little guy. None of this is your fault, Amy said, and Tails nodded, a relieved smile on his face. Alright, that wasn't my fault. Mr. Izuku is okay, Tails said, seemingly convincing himself. Amy nodded. Yep, he's perfectly fine. Amy continued keeping Tails' attention, not allowing him to see Izuku's body. Unbeknownst to both of them, Izuku was aware of everything, but something was going on deeper inside his psyche. Izuku saw nothing but darkness as he fell. He could tell that he was falling due to the wind that was blowing all over him, and the sensation of falling was pretty recognizable to him at this point, considering he fell large distances all the time. However, this was different as he could hear both Amy's and Tails' voices clearly from wherever he was. He couldn't help but smile at the sound of Amy comforting Tails, pride filling his heart. Izuku looked down, seeing a familiar sight rapidly approaching him. He attempted to activate OFA, but nothing happened. Izuku's eyes widened and he yelped as he flailed in midair, landing on his back, though there was no pain. Izuku sighed, standing up and dusting himself off, seeing the previous vessels of OFA surrounding something. Oh, there you guys are. I was wondering why it took you so long to communicate, Izuku said, alerting the 8 to his arrival. Young Midoriya, sorry about that. We've still been adjusting to the change. It's not every day that you go to another world, All Might's vestige said with an apologetic smile. Izuku nodded in understanding as he looked at what everyone was surrounding. Inside the ground was a bright green hexagonal tile, and it looked like the top of the Chaos Emerald that he had just touched. What did that emerald do? Izuku asked, and the first walked up to him. That's a good question, Ninth. Do you remember when you touched that girl's quills, and some sort of energy healed you? The first asked, and Izuku tapped his chin. Yes, I do. That was when my back was messed up by Eggman, Izuku said, and the first nodded. Well, that energy did something to One for All. It evolved it, the first said, and Izuku's eyes widened. Wait, what? What do you mean, it evolved? Izuku asked, and the first winced. Please don't yell. When you came into contact with that energy, it unlocked a new form of One for All, the first explained, and Izuku looked at him in confusion. Before he could ask what that meant, Banjo walked up to him, clapping him on the shoulder, making him stumble forwards. He's talking about when you got all buff that one time. Remember how you gained some muscle mass when you were fighting that robot, and you broke your arm? Banjo asked, and Izuku winced at the memory. That was probably the worst he had ever broken a limb. Yeah, I remember that, Izuku said, and a small emerald popped up in Banjo's hand. It wasn't the real one, just a manifestation of Izuku's mind. Well, this here emerald expanded upon that power. You can probably use it without crippling yourself now, but I wouldn't go too far with it. You're completely new to this kind of power. I suggest you train with that hedgehog girl that you've got the hots for, Banjo said, and Izuku full body flinched, looking at Banjo with a red face and a scowl. Banjo, I don't have a thing for Amy, Izuku yelled, and Banjo chuckled. Sure, kid, whatever you want to tell yourself. You can't lie to us though. We know that you've been alone for a long time. It's okay to love someone, kid, he said, and Izuku simply looked away, wanting the topic to be dropped. All Might shook his head in sympathy, walking towards Izuku with a gentle smile. I believe you should wake up now, young Midoriya. You have a couple ... What are they again? Mobians. You have a couple Mobians waiting for you, All Might said, smiling at him, and Isuku nodded, closing his eyes. We will be regularly communicating with you now. We probably should have let you know that we were still here, instead of just going radio silent, but even we make mistakes too, Nana said, and he could hear the grin on her face. Isuku smiled, concentrating on leaving the mental plane, before his eyes shot open in the real world once more. He sat up, hand on his throbbing head. He shook the fog out of his head, before looking at Amy comforting Tails. He smiled, before standing up. Guys, I'm alright, he said, and they both turned to him. Amy was expressionless for a second, before a massive scowl formed across her face. Why you idiot, she yelled, summoning her hammer and running towards him. Izuku yelped, quickly running away from her as she chased him. Do you know how scared I was? Do you know what it's like to see the last person in your life ... just crumple like that? Amy asked, tears filling her eyes. Izuku slowed down, looking at Amy as she fell to her knees, hands over her eyes, her hammer dissipating. Had the color of the weapon changed? Izuku shook his head, walking over to Amy and scooping her up in his arms. It's all right, Amy. I'm all right. Honestly, besides a slight headache, I feel great. Maybe even better than before. I promise I am okay, Izuku said, and Amy sniffled in his arms, wrapping her arms around him. Izuku walked over to Tails, smiling softly down at him. Hey, Tails. Thanks for showing me that emerald. It was really cool, he said, and Tails looked up at him, eyes wide and innocent. Really? He asked, and Izuku nodded with a grin. Yeah, I've never held a gemstone before, and it was really cool to hold one that beautiful, Izuku said, and Tails smiled back at him, though it didn't reach his cheeks. Thank you, Mr. Izuku, he said, and Izuku shook his head. Just call me Izuku. We're friends after all, he said, giving Tails a thumbs up as Amy asked to be let go. Izuku quickly placed Amy back on the ground, and she looked down, her eyes still moist. Sorry for chasing you, Izuku. I was just so scared. I'm not actually mad at you, I didn't know how to process what happened, so she said, being cut off by Izuku, who placed a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to explain yourself, Amy. I forgive you, he said, and she smiled back up at him, playing with her hands. Thank you, she said, and Izuku gave her a thumbs up in return. Suddenly, the sound of rapid footsteps approaching got everyone's attention, and Tails smiled at the familiar sound. Sonic's back, he said with a smile, before it dropped to horror. Oh no, Sonic's back. I'm not supposed to have these, Tails said, and Izuku looked at him, shaking his head. Don't worry, I'll cover for you. But next time something like this happens, you'll need to tell the truth. I'm only doing this because you already went through something rough, and you don't need Sonic yelling at you, Izuku said hurriedly, before Sonic skidded to a stop in front of them, an annoyed frown on his face. Tails, I thought I told you to stay home. Why are you out here with Amy and ... him? Sonic asked, making Amy scowl at the hesitation. Before she could say anything though, Izuku put a hand in front of her, stopping her from calling him out. I was just Tails started, and Sonic tapped his foot, impatient. Well, you were just what? Sonic asked, and Izuku stepped forward. I asked him to show me the Chaos Emerald. He didn't want to, but he said he'd only do it this one time since he trusts me, Izuku said, and Sonic's eyes widened. Wait, what? Tails, is this true? Sonic asked, and Tails froze up. He stumbled, and Sonic's eyes narrowed in realization. He looked up at Izuku with a scowl on his face. Listen, buddy, I don't appreciate you lying to get Tails out of trouble. He needs to learn what's wrong, and you just bailing him out won't do anything to help him, Sonic said, and Izuku sighed, knowing the jig was up. Normally, I'd agree with you, but Tails was already punished, Izuku started, but Sonic was already walking away, grabbing Tails by his ear and dragging him. Oh, Sonic, stop it. Tails whined in pain and discomfort, but Sonic shook his head. No, you're grounded, he said, and Izuku frowned, before shaking his head and running after them. Sonic, wait. Look, I know you don't trust me, but you need to listen to me. Something happened when I touched the emerald, Izuku shouted, and Sonic stopped, before he turned around, a suspicious look on his face. What do you mean, something happened? Explain, Sonic said, and Izuku sighed, quickly telling Sonic what happened to him. He left out the vestiges, but he did tell Sonic that his power was somehow altered by the emerald. Sonic's eyes widened, before he grabbed the bag from Tails' shoulder, opening it and looking inside. Which emeralds did you touch? Sonic asked. The green one, Izuku answered, and Sonic pulled it out, inspecting it closely. It's completely unchanged, Sonic commented, feeling the familiar thrum of power from the emerald. Izuku hummed, putting a hand to his chin. I know I took some power from it ... did one for all copy it. Is that even possible? Izuku asked himself, and a voice answered for him. Maybe the emerald has a self-sustaining power source. All Might proposed from within OFA, and a small smile overtook his face. That would make sense, Izuku said internally. And Sonic snapped in Izuku's face, taking him out of his head. Hey, geez, you spaced off immediately. I was trying to ask you why I shouldn't be punishing Tails for doing the exact opposite thing I told him to, Sonic said, and Izuku nodded. When I touched the emerald, I felt its power coursing through me for a second before I passed out on the spot. I could still hear everything, and well, Tails thought he had killed me. He obviously didn't. However, he thought he did. You can probably imagine how hard that was for him. So, now I'm asking you, do you really think Tails needs to be punished again? Izuku asked, and Sonic looked down at Tails in surprise. It was so obvious now. The slight tremble in his movements, the terrified lines under his eyes. He had originally thought that Izuku had done something to him, but he knew that if he tried, Tails would immediately bolt and get him. It all made sense now, and Sonic understood why Izuku was so adamant in not punishing the poor boy. You make a good point, I have to admit, Sonic said with a frown. Izuku nodded, before turning and walking away. Wait, Izuku, Tails said, before he struggled out of Sonic's arms. Izuku was about to turn around, only to feel Tails wrap his arms around his waist. I'm glad you're all right, he said, before rushing back to Sonic. Izuku was suddenly very glad that he wasn't facing the two, as his eyes filled up with tears immediately. Izuku simply gave Tails a thumbs up without looking at him, before continuing walking towards Amy, who was holding her hand over her grinning mouth. Oh my god, that was so adorable, Izuku said, wiping his eyes. The look on your face when he hugged you. Oh, I wish I had a camera. Oh, that was gold, Amy said, calming down. And Izuku shook his head, trying to seem unamused. He obviously failed horribly. Sonic watched Izuku and Amy enter their house, before he turned to Tails, his frown a lot softer than before. Okay, so you aren't grounded. But if you touch the Chaos Emeralds without my permission again, you can't go past our front yard for a month, Sonic warned, and Tails cringed at the punishment. Yes, Sonic, he mumbled, and Sonic lightly grabbed Tails' hand. Let's go home, buddy. I dropped some chili dogs off, and I got us a movie I'll think you like, Sonic said, and Tails gasped. Is it the movie based off your first adventure? He asked, and Sonic nodded, trying not to cringe. He knew it was going to be absolutely terrible, but he didn't want to spoil the kids' fun. Yep, I can't wait to watch it with you, bud, Sonic said, before they raced home. Back with Izuku, he looked around the house, feeling like he was forgetting something. Weren't we gonna do something today? He asked Amy, who looked at him for a second, before her eyes widened. You were gonna train me, she said, and Izuku snapped, smiling at her. Right, do you want to do that later or now? He asked, and she paused for a second. Let's just do it later. I'm still a bit shaken up by that whole Chaos Emerald jazz, she admitted, and Izuku nodded in understanding. That's fair. I honestly have some training that I'm gonna need to do as well. That emerald ... it changed OFA, Izuku said, his face set in a hard stare, and Amy's eyes widened. It ... it changed it? How? She asked, confused. Izuku looked down at his fist, clenching it. You remember when we were fighting Metal Sonic, when I got bulkier? Izuku asked, and she nodded, remembering the sight of Izuku stomping towards Metal Sonic and hitting him with the force of a super-powered train. Well, apparently that emerald expanded upon that power, whatever that means, Izuku said, and Amy lifted an eyebrow. Whatever that means. Shouldn't you know? You're acting like someone told you that, Amy said, and Izuku froze. Amy watched him closely, examining his strange body language. Izuku ... did you somehow speak to the emerald when you passed out? She asked, and Izuku looked at her, completely still for a second. Yes, he tried, and she immediately put her hands on her hips, staring him down. Okay, so if it wasn't that, then what was it? She asked, and Izuku looked away. I don't really want to talk about it right now. I will tell you, just ... not now, he promised, and Amy was about to argue, when her apology from yesterday echoed throughout her head. What am I doing? This is exactly what I did last time. I need to learn how to control myself, she thought to herself, before she nodded at Izuku. All right, if you don't want to tell me right now, I understand, she said, and Izuku exhaled, relieved. If she kept bungeing on it, he probably would have told her. He didn't want a repeat of yesterday after all. He smiled at her as she stretched and walked away. He was glad they had made up. He didn't know if he could handle her hating him. Is that because you like her, young Midoriya? All Might asked, and Izuku blushed. What? I already told you guys I don't like her, he replied mentally. Oh, but you have to admit she's cute. Those big old eyes of hers sure are doing her some favors, Nana said, making steam billow off of Izuku's face in droves. Shut up. Amy's not cute. Well, she's not cute, but it doesn't matter. I'm not crushing on her. I barely even know her, Izuku responded, and he heard a hum from the first. Well, you were referring to her when you said you'd felt like you've known someone your entire life, right? He asked, and Izuku groaned internally. I mean, yes, but he thought, and Banjo laughed. Huh, just admit defeat, kid. You ain't winning this one, Banjo proclaimed, and Izuku shook his head, ignoring him. He walked into his room, opening his closet and frowning at his costume. He really needed some more clothes. Izuku then had a realization. If Amy was going to be training with him, then she needed some clothes other than dresses and skirts. She would need some proper shorts, a t-shirt or tank top, and some better shoes as well. Izuku hummed, tapping his chin before he nodded. Amy, we've got to run some errands. I'll be waiting at the front door, Izuku said across the house, before walking to the door and leaning against the wall. After a minute, Amy walked out to the front door, a questioning look on her face. So, why do we need to go out? What errands do we need to run? She asked. Well, first of all, you need to get some new clothes, he said, and she looked down at her threads before looking back up with narrowed eyes. What's wrong with my clothes? She asked, and Izuku chuckled nervously, putting hands up. Gee, that's not what I was saying. However, if you're gonna be training, you can't wear that. Trust me, you're gonna thank me, Izuku said, and Amy sighed. If you say so. You clearly know what you're talking about, Mr. Muscles, she said, winking at him playfully. Izuku blushed at the action before he shook his head. Oh, I can't wait, Amy said, opening the door, and Izuku raised an eyebrow. Really, it's not that big of a deal, we're just shopping for clothes, Izuku said, his face slowly shifting to that of realization. He was going clothes shopping with a girl. Oh god, what have I dragged myself into? Izuku asked, looking up. If there was a god, then they had surely abandoned him. Amy rolled her eyes with an amused huff. Drama queen, she said, walking off. He further proved her point by dragging his feet as he walked, sulking. This is gonna suck, he mumbled. Poor guy.